Good evening and a very warm welcome to you all. Today is the third and last day of this lecture series organized by IQAC and the Department of English, Barabazar Bikram Tudu Memorial College. The last 2 days of this lecture series have been academically very prolific, and we thank all the participants for their wholehearted participation and response in this lecture series. Today, we'll be providing you with a feedback link in the chat box, and you have to complete the form and send it back to us by 10 a.m. tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. By 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, you have to send it back to us. So the feedback link will be provided to you in the chat box. In this lecture series, we have been very honored to have erudite scholars from all over the globe. And today we have the pleasure to host as our first speaker, Dr. Tim Lanzendorfer, who is an Heisenberg Research Fellow in Literary Theory, Literary Studies, and Literary Studies Education at Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany. He is the author of 3 monographs, including Books of the Dead, Reading the Zombie in Contemporary Literature, which was published in 2018, and he's the editor and co-editor of several essay collections. His current work deals with contemporary literary theory and the question of its public uses. Today, he will be speaking on the topic Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, Mashup, Genre, and the Question of Literature Today. Over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me. I hope this all works out. If I'm talking too fast, or if I'm talking too slowly, or too loudly, or too low-key, let me know. I can see the chat over there, so do let me know. Okay. As we heard, right, my topic today is going to be Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, Mashup, Genre, and the question of literature today. And I want to start by telling you like a few words about what it is that these terms entail, what I want to talk about in the first place, right? Mainly the question actually of what is the question of literature, because you can write that down very easily, and then you're stuck and you don't have anything to say about that. What this will end up being is it's going to be the question of what do we as literary scholars read? And it's also going to be the question of what is that thing, literature? And these two things are loosely but not totally connected. And I hope that will come through in the talk as I go along. And then I will talk about mashup and genre as connected to that very question of what is literature. When I say genre, I don't mean genre in the sense of a sonnet or a realist novel, or actually a novel versus a poem. What I mean is genre fiction. And genre fiction, of course, is horror, fantasy, crime, romance, right? All the kinds of, all the sets of texts that are usually talked about in derogatory terms within literary studies. Derogatory is a bit much, maybe, but that are not taken as seriously as literature writ large is, right? And then finally, I will be talking about, because I can't help not talking about them, zombies, which are the major kind of thing that this text, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, brings to the table. And what I want to say about them is essentially that they are a good benchmark, for lack of a better word, to test some of the genre problems that emerge when you try and connect genre fiction and literary fiction and literature. Okay, so I'll start with, I hope anyway, I'll start with my argument, which is, let's see if you can, I hope you can see my PowerPoint. Oh, that was that slide. Here's my argument. If you see the PowerPoint. I'll also, I'll say everything, so the PowerPoint is just there so you can have something to read while you're bored with my talk. My argument is this, essentially. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies lets us think about the way we understand literature, what we read and why, and challenges us to change our notion of what is worth talking about and why, which is admittedly not a great argument, but I'll try and fill this with a little bit of life as I go along. Okay, so the question that I want to start out with is the question of why it is Pride and Prejudice and Zombies particularly that asks us all of these questions. And the first thing that I want to say here is that it does so because of its mashup nature. Because the idea of the mashup is, well, no, let's back at that and say the idea of the mashup may be familiar to some of you from other contexts. Usually you encounter it in the context of music, where you tie together different samples from different songs and make them into a new song. So that's the idea of the mashup, and it's been in a couple of other contexts as well. In this case, obviously, what it does is it ties together a very, very canonical text, which is Pride and Prejudice, with a clearly genre-fictional motif or figure, the zombie. So it ties together a text that is already literature, Pride and Prejudice, with something that is clearly, quote-unquote, not literature, zombies. So the idea that it ties these things together is the first step. The second thing that is important for me here is that it is sort of very affirmatively, very clearly a genre text. And a couple of markers for that genre being are its publisher. It was published by Quirk Books. It's a Philadelphia imprint that did literally only this for a good long while, right? It printed books that took a canonical text, an out of print, but out of copyright anyway, text, and smashed some other kind of figure to it. Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, for example. Android Karenina, right? Those are the kinds of titles that Quirk Books published. And before that, it published sort of very fun, like present books that you, right? So joke present books. So the publisher tells you something about what this is supposed to be. The second thing that happens in it is that the author, Seth Grahame-Smith, is not a writer of any kind of fiction before he writes this. What he does is he published a book on the history of pornography, and not like sort of an academic history of pornography, but like porn films. He wrote a fake survival guide. He wrote what is essentially a humorous takedown of the George W. Bush administration, and so on, right? So Seth Grahame-Smith is not a fiction writer before he writes this. He's not a literary writer by any imagination at all. And then thirdly, another marker of its genre-ness is that the book is hack in the best sense of the word. Which is the sense that somebody made him write it for money, right? This was not an autonomous artistic decision. This was clearly a hack work, right? Somebody hired him to write a book that they hoped would be sold. And then finally, the fourth marker of its genre-ness is again the zombie, right? Without the zombie, this is nothing, but with the zombie, it is clearly and necessarily a genre text. Okay, but here's the hitch. These issues, right, these various markers of genre fiction-ness that I've just described are also why critics have widely panned the novel, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, right? Critics have not been kind to it at all. Here, the first set of voices that I want to talk about in this context. Jennifer Rutherford, in her study of the zombie as a cultural phenomenon, says quite simply, even the most avid zombie fan would be hard-pressed to defend this as a book worth reading. All right. Roger Luckhurst, in his Zombies: A Cultural History, which is a very, very good book, very, very good, says, the joke, a simple ramming together of high and low, Austen's genteel moral discriminations with vicious survival logic, rather outstays its welcome. I want to spend some time talking about these two quotes because they offer us an interesting glimpse into what they think is literature, what they think is happening here with regards to literature. And I think the obvious choice to go to here is Luckhurst's idea of the high and the low. The high and the low as persistent categories by which to situate literary writing in a continuum of value. Now, obviously, these texts are in some way adjudicating value, right? When Rutherford says it's not worth reading, probably, and I come back to the probably, that's a judgment of value. When Luckhurst says it outstays its welcome, that's a judgment of value, right? And it's not a judgment of sort of the value of it as a literary text, but of its value as a cultural object in the first place. And the question is, how are they coming to that conclusion? How are they doing that? Because the logic that they offer is not particularly sound at the first glance, right? So Luckhurst essentially juxtaposes the genteel moral discriminations, which are good, they're high, with the vicious survival logic, which is low. But how is this vicious survival logic bad, and say Cormac McCarthy is not when he writes The Road, or William Shakespeare is not when he writes Macbeth, right? And of course, Macbeth is about more than survival logic, but it's also about survival logic. So the question is here precisely, right? What is it that makes a book worth reading if this book is not worth reading? And the problem, and I'll want to come back to that in more detail in a minute, is precisely this, this notion that you come to a text with preformed categories. This is more clear, I think, in the next quote that I want to give you, which is this. And you will not know that gentleman, as you won't know these other gentlemen. And the only reason I'm giving you this particular quote is because it's so very eloquently ties together all of the details of the argument that hamper our reading of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And this is Eckhard Vogts-Virchow, who's also a German, interestingly enough, professor of English at Braunschweig. And he says of this, over a very extended discussion of it, it is probably not worthwhile to subject Pride and Prejudice and Zombies to a close reading new criticism style. Profundity and depth of meaning is not what one seeks in this campy celebration of popular genres. And I'm going to spend a couple of more minutes to unravel some of the issues that I see with this. Note again the idea of the worthwhile. Note again the valuative aspect of this. Now, I know that valuation is a thing that we consciously and unconsciously always do in literary studies, right? We always, by the very dint of selecting texts, will make a valuative judgment. But this is a sort of overt valuative judgment, right? It doesn't pay to talk about this text. But how and why, right? These issues get or stay unmentioned, right? On what grounds is it that it's not worthwhile? Usually, right? We saw that before. Now, Vogts-Virchow has a version of that, right? There's a very clear idea of when it's not worthwhile to talk about Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and that's to do a close reading, new criticism style. Now, if you're not familiar with the history of literary criticism, right, this might be sort of obscure. New criticism essentially was in late 1930s, early 1940s, into the 1950s movement of reading, especially poetry, as expressions of an artistic consciousness that essentially boiled down to their own form and the coherence of their own form. So when you did a new critical close reading, you took apart a poem's use of analogy and allegory and imagery, and you sought to distill from the poem itself some kind of interpretive meaning, right? So what you did when you did a close reading was you took the literary text as a coherent work of art, and you judged it on its language, on its use of metaphor, on the way that it made coherent sense, on whatever language felicities and infelicities you could sort of tease out of this, right? A new critical reading insists on the literariness of the literary text, and it's having a particular language feature that you could do work with, shall we say. Now, the one half of the point here is that there is no way in which anything today is worthwhile to subject to a close reading new criticism style, right? Nobody does new critical readings anymore. So this is in some ways a null point that Volkswirtschaftswoche is making here, right? It's not interesting for this new critical aspect. It's interesting precisely because of the close reading aspect, because close reading remains an important thing that we do. It's the only important thing really that literary studies does. It's the one thing that we excel at. It means essentially to take a text seriously, to work out how it produces its narrative, to work out how it produces its form, to pay attention to the precise constitution of the language, of the structure of the text, in order to come to an interpretive conclusion about it. Close reading is the literary critical operation, and to deny that this text is amenable to a close reading is to deny that it is amenable to literary criticism. Right? You can still do, he would probably say, a cultural studies reading, say, right? You could go and say, isn't it interesting how this does X, Y, and Z? You could do a book studies reading of this, right? A book history reading of this, and go and say, isn't it interesting how these out-of-print texts come back because they're cheap, they're free, right? In these different guises to make money for a publisher. All of these kinds of more or less contextual, historical kind of readings you could still do. What you cannot do is you cannot read it as a literary text. When you say you cannot talk about its literary text, as a literary text that is, you say you cannot talk about its meaning. You claim, essentially, that it has no meaning. It has no thing that is accessible to interpretative technique. Nothing that tells you anything more than the things that it already tells you very overtly, except insofar as they are contextual. Now, the interesting thing that happens here, then, is that by Volkswirtschaftswoche's claim, adding zombies to Pride and Prejudice is a way to deliteralize Pride and Prejudice. Right? Remember, it was literature. Now it's not. Now that there are zombies in it, the rest of the text doesn't have any meaning anymore. The bits with the zombies in it don't have any meaning in it anymore either, right? Everything you could do with Pride and Prejudice, you can no longer do with Pride and Prejudice. That's a weird thing to say. Even if it were true, though, and this is the second intervention, even if it were true, he says probably, right? It's probably not worthwhile. It's an assumption. He doesn't check it. It's not been checked. It is not even worth checking. The mere fact that zombies have been added to Pride and Prejudice, Volkswirtschaftswoche says, means that you cannot go out and look whether there is profundity and depth of meaning in this book. They're gone. You don't have to bother anymore. So return to the two previous texts, right? I mean, they've obviously read the book. Now they tell you, their audience, that you should not read it because there's nothing in it but this sort of very narrow, like minuscule intervention that it has, which is the joke, in Lacour's words. So this is the basis of all this, right? Pride and Prejudice exists. It's been read. People say it's crud. It's not worth checking. So the rest of this, and it's only going to be 15 more minutes or so before I turn over for questions to everybody, essentially, is to play through why that's not true, is to tell you that there is, in fact, profundity and depth of meaning in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And that book tells us something about the current state of literary studies and our beliefs about what literature is. Good, and then I think the next couple of slides will be the last ones, and then we can turn back to full screen if you like. I'll play this through, right? This claim that you can actually do meaningful work, that you can find meaning in Pride of Prejudice by reading one scene from it and then expanding, right? And asking you to do the work yourself and read those books yourself. And for that, we'll just briefly recall the plot of Pride and Prejudice up to the point where I need it, right? The plot of Pride and Prejudice is quite simple in many ways. The Bennet family, 4 daughters, I believe, and it doesn't really matter because we only need to know about Elizabeth Bennet, mom and dad. They live in a house that is entailed, which means essentially that on the death of dad, the house and all its income doesn't go to the daughters or the wife, but it goes to a distant relative. So the Bennet family are afraid of being turned out of the house in the near future. And then their reaction to that is what they'll do is they'll find husbands. The women find husbands, right? And that's it. For the rest of the novel, essentially, the point is, will Elizabeth Bennet marry Mr. Darcy, if you recall. So they do what they always do, is they go to balls, they meet other people, right? And this entire thing happens, of course, entirely in the strata of this weirdly middle upper class English landed gentry society spectrum. And the scene that I want to work through with you comes fairly early, chapter 18 of the novel. And what happens is that the Bennet family has been invited to a ball at Netherfield Hall, which is their neighbors. It's where Elizabeth first meets Mr. Darcy, who becomes then her husband. And towards the end of that chapter, we have this bit. And apologies if there's typos in this, because I just literally typed it up myself. Can you bring up the PowerPoint just so people can read along if they like? We'll just start reading anyway. At length, however, Mrs. Bennet had no more to say, and Lady Lucas, who had been long yawning at the repetition of delights which she saw no likelihood of sharing, was left to the comforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth now began to revive, but not long was the interval of tranquillity, for when supper was over, singing was talked of, and she had the mortification of seeing Mary, after very little entreaty, preparing to oblige the company. By many significant looks and silent entreaties, she did endeavour to prevent such a proof of complaisance, but in vain. Mary would not understand them. Such an opportunity of exhibiting was delightful to her, and she began her song. She looked at her father to entreat his interference, lest Mary should be singing all night. He took the hint, and when Mary had finished her second song, said aloud, and then we go and something else happens, right? It's not really sort of very important to the plot what precisely happens in this. That is the style of Pride and Prejudice, right? Things don't happen, really. There's lots of talking, lots of sort of very upper class problems. These are the genteel moral discriminations that Roger Luckhurst was talking about just earlier, right? And they're the only thing that's happening. The novel stays entirely in the drawing room. It stays entirely upstairs, as it were. It's interested in the machinations and the dialogue of its middle upper class characters and their fates, and that's all that drives its plot. Now, this is how Pride and Prejudice and Zombies changes this, right? The entire red part, it excises. Actually, a little bit longer because I have this ellipsis there, so this is a longer cutout. And it adds a scene of zombie attack. Fair enough, that's its gimmick. Quite a long scene, actually. And this is what I'm going to read to you next. So, we begin again at "For when supper was over." For when supper was over, not a servant was to be found to attend to their empty plates. Seeing his guests grow restless, Mr. Bingley rose from his seat and excused himself, no doubt to scold his steward for the embarrassment. Upon his return, Elizabeth promptly reached for her ankle dagger. Mr. Bingley's white face and troubled countenance were enough to solicit such a reaction. "Mr. Darcy, if I may have the pleasure of your company in the kitchen," said Mr. Bingley. Darcy rose, taking care not to move too quickly lest he alarm the guests. Elizabeth took it upon herself to follow him. When Darcy took notice of this, he turned to her and said in a whisper, "Miss Bennet, I would much prefer you took your seat. I am quite capable of attending Mr. Bingley myself." "Of that I have no doubt, Mr. Darcy, just as I have no doubt in my ability to form my own opinion on the matter. Now, do you wish to cause a stir, or shall we to the kitchen?" And we go on. I split this into two slides so you could follow along. Mr. Bingley led the two of them down a hidden staircase and into the cellar, which was divided into two halves by a long corridor. One side belonging to the servants' quarters and armory, the other to the exercise parlor and kitchen. It was in the latter that a most unfortunate sight awaited them. Two adult unmentionables, both of them male, busied themselves feasting upon the flesh of the household staff. How two zombies could have killed a dozen servants, 4 maids, 2 cooks, and a steward was beyond Elizabeth's comprehensions, but she knew precisely how they had gotten in. The cellar door had been opened to let in the cool night air and relieve the oppression of the wood stoves. "Well, I suppose we ought to take all of their heads, lest they be born to darkness," she said. Mr. Bingley observed the desserts his poor servants had been attending to at the time of their demise, a delightful array of tarts, exotic fruits, and pies, sadly soiled by blood and brains, and thus unusable. And then there's fighting. When they returned to the hall, they found the spirits of the others very much disturbed. Mary was entertaining them at the pianoforte. Good. So, this is what Pride and Prejudice does, right? Pride and Prejudice inserts these little vignettes of zombie fighting, but it's not just the zombie fighting, right? And you will have noticed that it's not just the zombie fighting. First, what it does is it makes Elizabeth very much a more proactive character, right? What Elizabeth does in this, and she never does this in her own, as it were, novel, right, in Pride and Prejudice, is she takes action. She goes and wants to fight those zombies herself. And she won't be stopped by a man, right? She won't actually be talked to by a man as a weaker, as a member of the weaker sex, right, in the sort of stereotypical way. More importantly for me, simply because of my theoretical predilections, is the way the novel here insists on this angle of the servants, whom we never, ever see in Pride and Prejudice, right? As I said, sort of Pride and Prejudice always stays in the upper class realm. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies wants you to go down and find out what it is that happens to the servants. And what happens to the servants is not good. Right? Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is very affirmative in the way it satirizes and parodies Pride and Prejudice's focus on the upper class. Right? How many servants does it take to enact a ball at Netherfield Hall? If you're a reader of Jane Austen, you won't know. If you're a reader of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, you do know. Not just do you know that it's at least 19 people to run such a ball, but you also know that the reason that they are all dead now is because their workplace is unbearable unless you do try and brave the zombies coming in from the cool night air. So the point that I want to raise here, right? And of course, right, in death, they are not somebody to be mourned. They're not somebody anyway, they're just a set of servants, but they're not to be mourned. What's to be mourned is the loss of the dessert. So what Pride and Prejudice and Zombies does, right, it lifts your gaze from the sole focus on the upper class and ties it down to the things that in a Jane Austen novel at best are hidden, at best are implicit, that literary critics may want to talk about, right? And the most famous example of that probably is Mansfield Park, where the wealth that the characters in Mansfield Park have, Sir Thomas especially, is clearly from slavery in the West Indies, and you can sort of read that into the novel. It's never expressly put in there, but you can do that, right? So there's a literary critical practice that lets you get at that problem. Excuse me. That is in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies straight away. Okay, does it require close reading? No, it does not. It just requires reading. It requires reading the text that is there, and then you have it. But the point is, it gives you something that Pride and Prejudice does not, in fact, have. This passage then shows us how Pride and Prejudice and Zombies wants us to read it. And it shows us one thing consistently as well, namely that its concern is with how to read Pride and Prejudice in the contemporary. Now, remember, right, this is the sort of canonical, clearly literary text that apparently everybody agrees is worthwhile to be read by literary critics. And then something interesting happens with it, whereas Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is not. But Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is what tells us how to do it. So, I'll begin my conclusion, essentially. I went out and told you that I want to talk to you about what this means for literature. And I want to suggest that there is, and I mean that, right? I want to suggest that because I have no hard evidence and I have not done any research on it. But it seems to me a persuasive claim to raise. I want to suggest that there is no difference at all between how people, actual people, read Pride and Prejudice and the way they read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. Which is to say, both readers of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies read for something that is almost like the plot, right? They are not interested in digging for the hidden things that the servants are in this, for example, right? So they wouldn't go and say, oh, I've read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. The servants are never mentioned. How critical is that, right? But readers of this book, especially readers today, and I'll come back to that, will be reading it as a plot story in exactly the same way as they will Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which, quote unquote, is a plot novel. So Pride and Prejudice, the Austen novel, is read as a comedy of manners, as a romance, as something that people can just sit back and enjoy, right? It's read as the story of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy's love story, essentially, in which what's fun is the verbal sparring and the will she or won't she aspect of it, and maybe the sort of vociferous embeddedness that you have in this higher upper class society that you will never get to, right? It is escapism in a way, right? It allows you to be part of a society that you will never ever be part of yourself, right? Which is why Bill Gates is probably not reading it, whereas your mom or your grandma or your aunt, right, or even you yourself may be reading it if you're just reading it for fun. This is what I would call the my God, isn't Colin Firth handsome version of Austen. The point, though, is that that does not detract from Jane Austen's book at all. The point is that everything that we want to do as literary critics with Austen is still perfectly valid. We can still do all of that. The point is also, though, coming on from that, that nothing that we can do with it, we cannot do with Pride and Prejudice and Zombies also. Because there's no difference between those two texts. The point is that you cannot talk about the meaningfulness of a text until after you have read it. And that seems an obvious point, but it's an obvious point that obviously also gets missed, say, by Volkswirtschaftswoche, the quote that I gave you just earlier, and also those other critics, and by people who will not read it. So what Pride and Prejudice and Zombies does is it plays off of a version of Jane Austen, a parody of Jane Austen, that is unconcerned with anything but the upper class's problems, and foregrounds, therefore, precisely that the upper class is only concerned with itself. That's a clever move. It's actually a very clever move that you cannot get at unless, of course, you read the text with due attentiveness to what it actually does. I'm not going to need the PowerPoint anymore, so if you want, like, if people still want my face, whatever they would want my face. So critics who would read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies differently from Jane Austen then are in a bit of a double bind / paradox, right? So they would want you to say, sure, you can close read Jane Austen. There's interesting things in it. It's very meaningful text. And they will also go and say, no, you can't read Seth Grahame-Smith because there's no meaning to be found in it. But like, think about what they're actually saying, right? They're saying to you, essentially, simple readings of Austen, like mom and dad's reading of Austen, do not exhaust Austen, right? So much deeper Jane Austen is, Yoda would say. That's to say, they say that Jane Austen, no matter what everybody does with it, is still literature, because even if everybody reads it stupidly, it need not be read stupidly, right? You can still read it smartly. But at the same time, they insist that Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is exhausted by stupid readings. Which is to say, no matter how we can read it differently, right, it still is not meant to be read that way. And they need to kind of hold both of these things together at the same time. The point then is that they highlight what literary studies does not want to engage, rather than cannot engage. They have a sense of literature that excludes Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, that forms their sense of what literary studies does, without coming first from the idea that literary studies can probably do meaningful work with that text. Good. And my genuine conclusion to this is, right, what does this mean for the question of literature today, then? This is not the most forceful take, by the way. There could be others, but try this emphasize. What Pride and Prejudice and Zombies does is it highlights the structures in which the question of literature today is embedded, which is to say, it shows us the impossibility of addressing this question without acknowledging the way it is embedded in strong value structures that are coming from literary studies scholars themselves. There is a disciplinary standpoint that affirms a commitment to the canonical and a disregard for probing its blind spots. That's very clearly on display when you contrast the reactions to these two texts. Now, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies offers a series of parodic takes, certainly of Pride and Prejudice, certainly of the deficits of Austen's novels in the contemporary, right, of its readership right now. It satirically takes on those readers, right? It does play with them in a way. It does kind of suggest to them you are missing the point when you do this, when you just read it as a love story. But it also satirizes the upper classes of the novel. And it satirizes the readers of the novel that are not the banal readers, but that are the literary readers, right? It satirizes us as literary scholars, in a way. When it satirizes the readers of the novel, it essentially goes and tells them, right, if you read Jane Austen and all you care for is whether or not Colin Firth is around, you are like those upper class characters in the novel, right? You go and bemoan the loss of comfort and of commodities rather than of the people who give lives to make those commodities, right? It's sort of a very powerful, if overt, cultural criticism of the contemporary. And again, it's meaning. That's good. You read it, you have a meaning. But it also offers a satirical take, and this is really the last line that I'm giving you, a satirical take on literary studies. Because this literary studies, our literary studies, my literary studies anyway, right? I can't actually speak to Indian literary studies, but European Anglophone literary studies understands itself, despite sort of best practices ideas, as a caretaker of literariness, as a caretaker of a particular kind of writing, and of an established Western canon, and of reading practices that are in preference of greater complexity of language rather than of the substance of an argument. And if it can do that, right, and that's the sort of last thing, if it can do that, then by all means, it's perfectly worth talking about Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And more people should be doing it. With that, I conclude. Thank you very much, and I hope this was worth your time. Okay, and questions, right, whenever you have them. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, team, for this wonderful discussion. Now let me tell to the audience that for a better way of dealing with it, yes, for a greater way of dealing with it, to the text and what team has tried to convey, the readers can go through Sophie Gilbert's article on Pride and Prejudice and Zombies from classic romance with a nasty bite, where she shows how the rollicking adaptation of Seth Grahame-Smith's 2009 mashup gives Jane Austen's beloved novel an undead twist. And at the same time, let me share with you all that you guys can go through Tim's book, Book of the Dead, Reading Zombie in Contemporary Literature, published by the University of Mississippi in 2018. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, in 2018, and you guys can give it a worth reading for those who are particularly interested in zombie fiction and broadly speaking on zombie literature. And books like this can prove the fact that how zombies have managed to be accepted as adequate metaphors beyond purely fictional literary or filmic engagement. And let me tell you, quote to some how Tim's book opens with. It begins with the only modern myth, and where he has discussed taking Felix Guattari and Deleuze's famous note that we have come across in Anti-Oedipus, that is, it's the myth of zombies. The only modern myth is the myth of the zombies. And to Deleuze and Guattari, zombies signify the particular relation between death and the capital that modern life has produced. There's a kind of work myth, and their mutilated status is a necessary condition for all of us and for the contemporary state also. So the zombie trope, as the critics agree, has penetrated deep into the cultural consciousness, permitting the zombie to become a readily readable metaphor. And at the same time, one so ubiquitously can say that it has become available even far outside our entertaining industry also. And the global economic crisis of 2008 and the consequent increasing critical engagement with the problems of late capitalism have not coincidentally been read through the zombies. Here in Tim's book, let me tell you, he is too shy to tell something about his book, but it's a wonderful read, and there are 6 chapters. Let me tell you a brief outline of those chapters so that you guys can have a look at it, and I will post the link to buy the book also. The 6 chapters offered by this study give a convincing reading of the zombie as a crucially relevant figure in contemporary literature, and providing a reading of a contemporary moment that needs to be reminded of the possibility of a change. And in this coda, he discusses what all means for the status of fiction more generally, and argue that zombies present a kind of general trend which seeks the increasing elimination of difference between the so-called literary and genre fiction is a kind of representative position for which he sees it as being specially well suited. And Tim hasn't offered a kind of unified reading of the zombies as a trope in contemporary fiction, because such a thing is neither helpful or instead not possible. But rather, the zombies' metaphorical role as the contents throughout the book, I guess, is less important than the world it enables. And rather than stressing its emptiness, we need to foreground that the zombies itself is rarely the most crucial element of zombie fiction and fictional meaning. So you guys can have a look at it at the book. And Tim, mm, thank you for this fascinating lecture. And let me take some of the questions.
Sure.
There is one interesting question. That Stella has asked that the original novel by Austen definitely has a very emphatic feminist angle, especially through some definite instances where Elizabeth actually defies certain stifling expectation that society had of women during those times. How is that paralleled in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies? It's just been curious and want to know your take on it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not an expert on Pride and Prejudice myself, right? So I resort to reading secondary sources on this. One of the things that struck me was that there was a bit of a debate on precisely this notion of how feminist Elizabeth is, sort of not just as a figure in a novel, but as a figure from, say, 1810 to 20, right? Sort of a figure in her own time. And I went with the version that agreed with that, right? That Elizabeth already was a feminist figure in this. Now, the interesting thing about Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is that on the one hand, it makes Elizabeth Bennet and the rest of the Bennet sisters much more overtly proactive figures, right? Because they are already at the beginning of the novel like fighters, right? They fight the zombies, which they don't, spoilers, in Pride and Prejudice. So they already go out. But the problem that they have is that when they marry, the expectation is that they end that fighting, right? Everybody in the novel sort of goes and says, well, when you become my wife, I expect you to hang up the sword and instead devote yourself to my kitchen and my children. So this is a sort of in a way, the stakes are much higher in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies because they are like independent women. The Bennet sisters are. Elizabeth ends up marrying Darcy in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And she does end up saying, okay, I'll hang up my sword. And that is sort of a problem for the feminist angle of this. I think it sort of translates well into this, the idea that this is a book that critiques Austen, that it's a book that critiques readers because it confronts them more overtly with the radical change that this is for Elizabeth, right? In any romance, probably sort of happily ever after, being married happily ever after is the sort of go-to ending, and people are happy with it. In this, it becomes really, really stark and becomes this sort of stumbling block for reading the novel as an affirmation of feminism, except as a satirization of the other novel's sort of tepid feminism. Again, like sort of not tepid for whenever it was written, 1830, but tepid for now. So when you read it now and you sort of go and say, what a strong figure that is, people should go and say, no, that's not a strong woman, right? That's a strong woman for 1830, but it's not a strong woman for 2020.
Okay. There is another question, that is how zombies can be related to medieval literature and during these pandemic times.
Easily, right? Very easily. I was just as I was reading this again for giving this talk, I discovered that it had loads of mentions of sort of both the question of living with and finding a cure for, right? And the sort of discussion of whether or not it's good to accommodate while you're looking for a cure, or whether you should not accommodate in order so you are more geared towards finding a possible cure, right? It, like, to its credit, and most zombie fiction doesn't do that either, right? It doesn't answer the question. It doesn't go and say, cure, that's what you should be going for, or just bear it, right? but it has all of these connections. Like if I wrote this today, that would probably be the ask that people would have of me, reviewers, right? When I sent this to the publisher said, add something about Trump. Now, presumably, they would go and say, well, can't you say something about COVID-19? And you could. It's clearly in there.
Okay. So Tim, also tell me that there is one particular article that I've gone through a few days ago. It's about Hannah Jorgensen, and she tried to tell that though promising Pride and Prejudice and Zombies loses its early footing and fails to right itself, and thereby becoming more and more, I think, some kind of off balance as the minutes ticked by, and at the same time, ultimately the film, while I'm talking about the film, it aligns itself with the uncomfortable type of comedy at the same time, where the actors are no longer is on the joke. So the problem combines, I think, with the strange, voyeuristic, and entirely too long camera shots of some kind of Lily James, what I can say, hyperventilation, and at the same time, it's a kind of present era nickelness, and all this kind of thing made a film that frustratingly could and should have been better. So do you think there is a further chance of some kind of modification while doing all these films, or making a filmic adaptation, or screening adaptation of the text into the films? Where can we do this kind of modification?
I will say I don't know, because I've thought about this. I saw the film. I saw the film also of World War Z, if you've seen that. I feel like I'm not equipped to talk about that, because whenever I see something like that, I just go and say, I don't like, or that's wrong, but I don't ever have a really informed theoretical kind of approach to this. I will say I was okay with the film of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I will also say that it's sort of, obviously, right, it heavily focused on the action compared to the book, right? The book is not quite 50% like new material and old material. So it's really very much Austen. There's lots of talking in this book. There isn't a lot of talking comparatively in the film, because it makes for a bad action film. Sort of like it has a different. Yeah.
I was just curious, and I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Team. The coexistence of the humans and the zombies in the book, and the world with the zombies, does it in any way indicate an alternate world which we are actually heading for?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, and it never does. Is one of the things, sort of one of the takeaways I had when I wrote the book, was that the zombie is a very awkward figure to be the projection ground for our utopian hopes, because it's a freaking dead monster, right? You can't want to be the zombie. You can't root for the zombie to win, because it's stupid and it decays and it stinks and it eats people. So you don't want that. But it does sort of always open the question of sort of how do we react to that kind of a threat? How do we build a society that works when you are in duress? Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, that book, the first book, the one that I was talking about, doesn't have a good answer to that, right? It doesn't actually sort of give you a utopian thing, because it's, as I said, right, a parody and a satire. The two other books in the series, they give you these kinds of answers, right? They will have those scenes where upstairs and downstairs, right, they combine, they work together to fight the zombie horde. And that's actually what the takeaway from my book is usually, right? The zombie never is hope, but the zombie is always occasion for moments of hope.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at the same time, let me share you that here in India also now we are also heading towards this kind of interdisciplinary studies, and movies and web series are on zombie also. For example, if I am not so wrong, Saif Ali Khan's there is a film Go Goa Gun or something like this. Or recently we have gone through Betal, the four-part Netflix film. Or some kind of web series. There's Shah Rukh Khan as an uncredited producer, and it has been marketed as the first Indian series with zombies. And at the same time, you love to know that here the zombies love to bite and turn humans to their cause, but they don't pursue their prey rapidly, and instead Betal's undead operates at the behest of the leader who can command them and speak through them. And after resurrection, the infected who they can talk, and they are, we have also mixed some kind of superstition at the same time, mythological interpretation to that story of Betal. So now in India also this kind of study is rapidly going on. And I think that zombies can be related to some kind of post-apocalyptic future, or we can say it's a kind of Asian futurism, and that the futurism that you are talking about, from a Eurocentric point of view, it has been started a long ago. But from Indian perspective, there is a kind of a new kind of Asian futurism, and where we are also dealing with this kind of zombie studies. That is why films, a lot of and I guess in future a lot of films like uh, Land of the Dead or the Resident Evil uh, will come in Bollywood also. So we are also heading towards this kind of future. So do you think that this is a kind of futuristic society that you are also talking about in this post-apocalyptic scenario?
I'm very interested to hear, first of all, of that development. Like one of the things that I'm always struck by is how the idea of the mass, right? The idea of the zombie as a horde, is very uncomfortable. For example, in World War Z, if you've read that, I think it's different. Yeah, it's different in the film, but in the book, the zombie virus comes from China. So you have this dangerous Chinese horde, right, that sort of takes over the world. And that's awkward, to say the least, right? So I've not actually looked at Chinese zombie film, but sort of offhand, the same sort of reappropriation mechanisms would certainly apply in an Indian context, right, where you would have to take that idea of a mass of people, which, like, sometimes it gets turned into the mass, the communist mass, right, the socialist mass, as in Land of the Dead, for example, where it's exactly that, right, the uprising of the 99%, essentially. Yeah, so I lost the train of thought here, but I have to look into Indian zombie fiction then. Oh, one of the things I want to say is that I have this sort of very specific narrow definition of the zombie,
You
which
should
does...
watch that Betal. It is in Netflix. You should watch that Betal.
Like, how do you spell that? B-E-T-A-L?
B-E-T-A-L. Betal.
T-A-L. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll look that up. I've not seen that. Super.
Okay, so thank you very much, team, for your stimulating speech on zombie fiction, literature, and studies in general. And your observations will be extremely helpful to those doing research on this area. And but these are the welcome updates in this overdone zombies genre, and often it is seen that many interested researchers here in India are at a standstill in their progress because of the lack of study materials or the relevant works on zombie studies. But your talk, and certainly as well as your book, may provide them a much needed help. And thanks again for giving a tremendous momentum to a truly memorable evening. We hope you can join us again.
I hope so too. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the kind notes in the chat. This has been very enjoyable. I hope that the rest of the series goes well. And I'll talk to all of you soon, I hope.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And bye-bye.
Bye. Stay safe. Yes,
The
Orkoda
lecture
with us.
truly, the lecture truly widened our horizons, and we are very thankful
Orkoda,
to Dr. Team.
Orkoda,
We
you are
have
not
with us,
visible.
Yeah, I did not
Ah,
make myself
yes,
visible
yes, yes,
before
yes.
the talk started. Yeah.
we already have with us another very erudite academician with us as our second speaker, Dr. Orko Chattopadhyay, uh, who is an assistant professor of literary studies in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar, India. He has done his graduation, master's, and MPhil in English literature from Presidency College and Jadavpur University, India. He has written his MPhil thesis on Samuel Beckett and Alan Badu and finished his PhD from Western Sydney University on Beckett and Lacanian psychoanalysis. He has been published in books like Deleuze and Beckett, Knots, Gerald Mernon, Another World in This One, etc., and journals like Miranda, Textual Practice, Interventions, Samuel Beckett Today, Azord, and Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, Sound Studies, and the Harold Pinter Review. He has co edited the book Samuel Beckett and the Encounter of Philosophy and Literature and has guest edited the SBT, which is an issue on Samuel Beckett and the extensions of the mind. He is the chief editor of the online literary journal Shonglap, which is one of the best online journals available. His first monograph, Beckett, Laka, and the Mathematical Writing of the Real, has been published by Bloomsbury in 2019. He is currently co-editing a volume on Navarun Bhattacharya for Bloomsbury, India, slated for 2020, and is working on a volume on Badiou and modernism. Today, he'll be speaking on the topic mathematics, psychoanalysis, and modernist literature. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me here. A very good evening to both of you and anyone who's listening. And yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful series that both of you, and I'm sure with the help of your colleagues, you've put together. And I'm honored to be part of this. And I'm very happy to talk about my research area in a somewhat general way today. So I will be talking in this particular lecture, I'll be talking about, let's say, how to read mathematical questions in literature through philosophy of mathematics and psychoanalysis. And because I work on modernist literature, my examples and the kind of texts I would go through would primarily comprise of modernist texts in Europe as well as in India in certain ways. So this comes out of the doctoral thesis, which has since then become a book, Beckett, Lacan, and the Mathematical Writing of the Real. But I'm also in the initial stages of thinking through a book on mathematical tropes and modernist literature in a slightly wider form, let's say, which would not be about one particular writer. And while I will continue to use psychoanalysis, there would be a larger philosophical question of mathematics that would ground that book. So what I would present today is, let's say, some general thoughts towards mathematization of literature, mathematization of philosophy, and what these questions mean for modernist literature. So to begin, on a rather simple note, let's just say that mathematics, among many other things, like many other things, is also a literary theme. And while this might sound fairly passé to all of you, this has not been acknowledged for a long time. And I mean, thinking about, especially as literary studies students, those of you who are listening, if one says politics finds representational content in literature, you won't be bewildered necessarily. Love, if someone says, finds a representational space in literature, again, you wouldn't necessarily be befuddled. But if someone says mathematics is also represented in literature, as a literary theme or a literary trope that might bewilder someone. Because again, it's not been a long time since we have started addressing mathematical tropes in literature. And before my book came out, I would like to acknowledge a few other works which, in a way, addressed this, perhaps for the first time. And interestingly, all of them more or less date from 21st century. So it's a relatively new field of development. Of course, there were comments on mathematical aspects of literature, but literary studies has been a little bit slow to pick up on these mathematical questions in literature. So there are two books that I feel like mentioning within literary studies that address the mathematical question. One is Nina Engelhardt's book on modernism and mathematics, primarily focusing on numbers. And again, Bailey Britt's soon after, another book which is primarily on numbers, the trope of numbers in modernist literature. What I tried doing, and I'll come to that afterwards, what I tried doing was to come to this question of philosophical, let's say a philosophical question of mathematics in literature through psychoanalysis, through Lacanian psychoanalysis, which has its own mathematical turn. Lacan turns to mathematics and mathematical discourse to formalize psychoanalysis in a certain kind of way in his later teaching. So in the book, I was primarily concerned with Samuel Beckett, the Irish French writer's engagement with mathematical forms, mathematical questions in his texts, especially in his late prose texts, and Lacan's interest in mathematical forms, in mathematizing psychoanalysis in his later teachings. And I tried situating these two together in the ethos, in the theoretical as well as literary ethos of modernism. And I was trying to address certain questions that I would come to very soon. But for this talk, as I said, I would like to pan it out and talk about first mathematics as a potentially literary trope or a literary theme. So to, just to substantiate that point, let me straight away go to two examples. And these are both quite important texts in two very different traditions of modernism. And I'm talking about poetry here. The first is a late poem by W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. It's called The Statues. Most of you would be familiar with this poem, but I want to address how Yeats, throughout this poem, refers to a mathematical trope through philosophy. So he's talking about Pythagorean numbers here. Let me read the poem, at least parts of it. So the poem begins with that. This is Yeats, The Statues. Pythagoras planned it. Why did the people stare? His numbers, though they moved or seemed to move in marble or in bronze, lacked character. But boys and girls, pale from the imagined love of solitary beds, knew what they were, that passion could bring character enough, and pressed at midnight in some public place, live lips upon a plummet-measured face. Again, the second stanza also has references to Pythagoras. I'll skip that and come to the final stanza, where again, as you know, for those of you who've read the poem, in this particular poem, Yeats is thinking about Doric art and Greek art, and he's in a way ruminating on, let's say, the entire, the gamut of the various cultures in human civilization, placing Ireland in relation to Asia, in relation to Europe. And of course, we know of Yeats's encounter with Tagore. I do want to talk a little bit about Tagore after this. So he's amalgamating, let's say, all these different transnational traditions. And in the last stanza, again, he comes back to the trope of numbers. When Peirce summoned Cuchulainn to his side, what stalked through the post office? What intellect, what calculation, number, measurement replied? We Irish, and these are very famous lines, we Irish born into that ancient sect, but thrown upon this filthy modern tide, and by its formless spawning fury wrecked, climb to our proper dark, that we may trace the lineaments of a plummet measured face. Now, what we see in this poem, if we pick out the trope of numbers, is a very interesting mapping of Pythagorean numbers on Greek architecture. The statues, as the poem says, the statues seem to be measured. And Yeats elsewhere on the boilers and in other places has talked about the importance of mathematical measurement in the making of the statues. So he considers number and measurement to be part of aesthetics, the aesthetic construction of the statues. So let me mark that point, mathematics as part of aesthetics, okay? That's the point I'm trying to make. But we also see, and this is a very significant question in philosophy of mathematics, the question is, to what extent can we or should we couple mathematics with rationality? Is mathematics simply going to bolster a kind of rationalism, okay? Or whether literature, and this is where literature comes in, and this is my larger question, whether literature allows us to think through mathematics in a way that is not necessarily rationalist. I'm not saying rational, but rationalist. So I think literature, in a way, allows us to widen the scope of mathematics outside of rationalism, a philosophical position where all experience would come from a kind of a logic, and that too in a very restrictive sense. So what we see in this poem is a hesitation on the part of W.B. Yeats about where to place the numbers. Where are these numbers located? Are they on the bronze? Are they on the marble? Do they lack character? As he says, his numbers, Pythagoras' numbers, though they moved or seemed to move in marble or in bronze, lacked character. And then at the end, a very important hesitation, what intellect, what calculation, number, measurement. So he's drawing up a list where intellect, calculation, number, and measurement, they go hand in hand. But this is precisely my question. Is mathematics as a way of thinking reducible to calculative rationality? I think in certain ways, modernist literature opens out mathematical discourse, and that's why I say out. It opens it outside of this calculative field of rationality. Not that this calculative field of rationality stops being of importance at all, but the calculative field of rationality cannot contain mathematical thinking. Mathematical thinking seems to sort of brim the surface of calculative rationality. And we'll talk in more detail about these examples. Now, to pit Yeats with at least his one-time friend, let's say, the Bengali Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, let me quote a very different poem of a very different nature. This is a nonsense verse taken from his 1937 book of poems, which were significantly dedicated to Rajshekhar Boshu, another great writer of the grotesque, great writer of the absurd. And this is Rabindranath trying his hand at nonsense verse. I mean, nonsense verse has not been one of those privileged forms within modernism, but we know that with Gertrude Stein and others, nonsense verse has also had its very important role within, especially a female contextualization of modernism. Now, I'm sorry that there is no English translation available, or at least one that I could find for this poem. So for those of you who cannot follow Bengali, I will explain the poem, but it's impossible to translate a poem like this because of the end rhymes and also the very genre of the nonsense verse, let's say. So I'll explain the context, but let me read the poem first. This is a poem, as I said, from Khapchara, which means something haphazard. Tagore goes, গণিতে রিলেটিভিটি প্রমাণের ভাবনায় দিনরাত একা বসে কাটালো সে পাবনায়। নাম তার চুনিলাল, ডাকনাম ঝড়কে, একগুলো সবই এক, সাদা আর কালো কি? গণিতের গণনায় এমতটা ভালো কি? অবশেষে সাম্যের সামলাবে তোড়কে। একের বহর কভু বেশি কভু কম হবে, এক রীতি হিসাবের তবুও কি সম্ভবে? ৭ যদি বাঁশ হয়, ৩ হয় খড়কে, তবু শুধু ১০ দিয়ে জুড়বে সে জোড়কে। I'm not reading the third and final stanza. Let me, for those of you who do not understand Bengali, let me lay this out. So it's interesting, this poem was published as part of Khapchara in 1937, and after Tagore's encounter with Einstein. The poem begins with a character called Chunilal in a place called Pabna, who's trying to prove relativity in mathematics. I mean, I'm literally translating that sentence. He's trying to prove relativity in mathematics. And he's wondering about the different values of the number 1. Ekgulo shobi ek, shada ar kalo ki. So is the number 1 all the same, whether it's black or white? Thinking about the letters on the page, black on white as well. And then now the image that I want to dwell on, and it's a profound image which takes us to one of those fundamental questions about mathematics and literature. The image is this, and let me read it in Bengali and then unpack it again in English. ৭ যদি বাঁশ হয়, ৩ হয় খড়কে, তবু শুধু ১০ দিয়ে জুড়বে সে জোড়কে. So not to comment on the wit, of course. What is the image? Tagore is likening the number 7 with bamboo shoots. And khorke is a small little, fragment of a bamboo shoot. I mean, you can make a little piece from the bamboo shoot, the huge bamboo shoot, and that would be number 3. So 7 is a larger number than 3. You can make 3 from 7 by subtracting 4. And then the next line goes, tobu shudhu ১০ দিয়ে জুড়বে সে জোড়কে. But this is the important point. While 7 plus 3 is 10, when you add, bamboo shoot with khorke, which is a small part of a bamboo shoot, you do not necessarily get that 10. So 7 plus 3 is 10 in numbers, but if you take the numbers as symbolic of real objects in the real world, the calculations may not work exactly in the same way. And this is a very important point Tagore makes in a very different register from Yeats's. I mean, the poem that I read from Yeats is a late poem. It's full of that solemn intensity of, Yeats's voice. Whereas this particular poem is flippant. Tagore's poem is flippant, right? And in this poem, Tagore is pointing out something that I will use as a segue to talk about philosophy of mathematics now. This discord between mathematics and language. But it's not just a discord. Let's say there's a dialectical tension between mathematics and language. And this becomes one of those very important sites of investigation for modernist literateurs who are trying to experiment with language. So the large claim that I make, of course, there are particular readings of Beckett that I do in the book, which I won't spend a lot of time on in this particular talk. But the larger claim I'm trying to make in the book, and let me make that claim here, is that on the one hand, mathematics as a discourse, as an operational discourse, seems to give the modernist writer a possibility for an autonomous discourse, a discourse that is self-dependent. As we know, in modernist literature, there's a drive to go beyond realism. In a realistic text, we think of a correspondence between the text and the real world. mathematics, now this is the important question, is mathematics independent as a language of reality? Is mathematics autonomous as a discourse, as a language? And this is a question that seems to plague a lot of modernist writers, and Beckett is one of the more important voices, I would say, in that pantheon. On the one hand, mathematics seems to liberate the modernist writer from the limited clutches of realism. It promises something that is going beyond representation and offering some sort of an autonomous discourse. But on the other hand, is mathematical discourse truly autonomous? That's a question we have to ask. And here I invoke, at least mention, we don't have the time to go into the details, but here I invoke the work of the Indian philosopher of mathematics, Sundar Sarukkai, who has made this point very cogently across his different articles. I'm thinking of an article on mathematics, language, and translation, and an article where he talks about mathematics and effective communication, effectivity of the mathematical discourse. So this is a point he has made. I'm simply summarizing his long and complex argument that the history of mathematics has always tried to hide the fact that it has to depend on natural language. Mathematics as a discourse has always hidden from us the fact that it has a certain degree of dependency on natural language. When I say natural language, I mean, the language that we are speaking right now. So mathematics is a language, but at the same time, it's not entirely autonomous vis-a-vis human language, vis-a-vis natural language, what we call natural language, the language that we are speaking in now. So mathematical discourse offers this promise of a new language for modernism. And as we know in the Poundian register, making it new, that's the credo of modernism. And modernism wants to reinvent the novel, reinvent all the genres, and again, try and think of itself as, let's say, beyond representation. But can mathematics allow modernist literature to go beyond linguistic representation? I would say no. But what it does is, when we look at this encounter of mathematics and modernist literature, we see this tension that I'm talking about. And what emerges is a very interesting failure of mathematical discourse to offer this autonomous discourse, this autonomous language. So that's one point I wanted to make. But as I said, this will be a general talk, and I'll try and talk about all the different ways in which we could engage in a discussion of mathematics and literature. And finally, I'll come to psychoanalysis at the end. So I've already talked about mathematics and language, mathematics and autonomy. Let's also talk a little bit about mathematics and writing. Again, this is a point Jacques Derrida has made very specifically. I'm thinking of his interview positions, but we see a lot of mathematical metaphors in Derrida's writing. Just to give a literary example, because most of you may be familiar with that, in his essay on the genre in Acts of Literature, a collection of his articles on literature, Derrida uses a set theoretical metaphor, and he says that every literary text participates in a genre, but does not necessarily belong to that genre. This is a set theoretical trope: participation without belonging. I mean, this is a whole history we could map, the history of mathematics and philosophy, which is a long and complicated history, and clearly I won't be able to do justice to that, but I'm just trying to map out a few questions. What are the important philosophical questions around mathematics? From Plato's time, one of the most important questions, one of the key questions about mathematics has been, where does the mathematical world exist? I'm getting some sort of feedback. If I could request someone whose audio might be on to kind of switch it off if possible. It's good now. Thank you. Okay, so from Plato's times, this has been a very, very important question for Plato. In fact, the word mathema, mathema, means knowledge, and Plato uses this word repeatedly in his work. So mathematics is also an epistemological question, a question of knowledge, and it was long considered the highest form of rationality, the highest form of knowledge formation. But again, that's something that I'm trying to question in a way. Now, mathematics and writing, to come back to that, and to come back to the philosophical questions. So where is the mathematical world? Where does it exist? Does mathematics exist in our world, the real world of objects, or does it exist in some other reality, in some other noumenal reality, as Plato would say? So this has been a question from the very inception of Greek antiquity, and it's not just Plato. For example, Beckett refers to pre-Socratics when he initially gets interested in mathematics. He refers to figures like Hippasos in contradistinction with Pythagoras in his early novel Murphy. So in any case, we are coming back to this question, and let me use a particular moment, a very interesting moment from James Coetzee's late trilogy. I'm thinking of the book The Childhood of Jesus, but we have similar moments in the second book as well, The School Days of Jesus. Now, I'm just giving an example, as it were. So we have a moment here when young David, the protagonist, is being taught mathematics by his mathematics teacher. The mathematics teacher is trying to teach him numbers. And when the mathematics teacher has 3 apples there, and then takes away 1 apple and says, okay, so that was 3. When you saw 3 apples, I've taken out 1, now it's 2. So this is a subtraction. 3 minus 1 is 2. David asks a simple but extremely profound question. He says, but why are you calling them numbers? They're apples. This goes back to the Platonic question, where is the mathematical world in existence? Where does it exist? Does it exist in the object? Is number a quality of an object, or is number a thing in itself? And for those of you who are familiar with this trilogy of novels that I'm talking about, you would see that Coetzee develops a wonderful mythology of numbers in the second book. I won't go further into that, but this is a very important point. What are mathematical objects? Where do they exist? But I started talking about mathematics and writing, so let me talk a little bit about that. Again, the relationship between speech and writing is particularly special in mathematical discourse. It's particularly special because, just think of it operationally. When we are working out sums, we write, and we write first. We don't necessarily speak and then write. This is what interests Derrida, who's always interested in that relation between speech and writing. And as you know, Derrida would make this sort of strategic claim that writing has a certain primacy over speech, one of those famous initial claims of deconstruction of grammatology. So when Derrida talks about writing, he gets interested in mathematical discourse because it offers him
Hello, Gota.
Hello. Wait for the
I
technical
think,
glitches we are facing.
yeah.
Hello?
Yes, yes,
Am I audible now?
yes,
Can you,
yes,
Yes,
yes, yes,
yes,
right, sorry, I think I lost
yes.
my connection there. Okay, so let me
No.
resume. So for both Jacques Derrida and Jacques Lacan, in two different ways, which we may not have the time to discuss today, but I'm happy to answer questions if there are those questions. Both get interested in mathematical discourse because mathematical discourse offers a new idea of writing or inscription, a writing that does not need to depend on speech. And that's why I gave this very simple example of any mathematician trying to work out a sum, or even our own failed attempts maybe in school when we were trying to work out a sum. We begin from writing, and that's a very important question. What Lacan calls discourse without speech, mathematics offers Lacanian psychoanalysis a discourse without speech, a discourse where something can be written independent of speaking, independently. Again, that question of independence or autonomy comes into the picture. So, and this brings us to the question of materialism as well. So, for Lacanian psychoanalysis, and I'm going a little bit into that question with this, let me make a clarificatory remark here. If one asks, why do we need to go through psychoanalysis to talk about mathematics in literature? I would say the whole question of thinking about mathematical questions through literary discourse comes from a difference that humanities perspectives could introduce into mathematics. Because of course we are not working out mathematics. I'm not a mathematician. I would consider my work to be located around philosophy of mathematics through psychoanalysis. Why psychoanalysis? Because psychoanalysis humanizes mathematics. Not in the sense of humanism, but we see the connection between the human subject and mathematical questions. For example, and this is not just Lacan all alone by himself, this has been a very important question. Again, to name an important book for those of you who are interested in this research field, Jeremy Gray wrote a book called Plato's Ghost in 2008. And this was a major book which went through history of mathematics in a philosophical way and talked about what Gray called the modernist transformation of mathematics. And this book played a very important role in opening up the question of mathematics for modernist literature. In this book, for example, at one point, Gray talks about psychology and numbers, and he talks about the famous French mathematician Henri Poincaré, who has written about something like mathematical unconscious. How does a mathematician work, and how does a mathematician create mathematics, invent mathematics? His work, his essay has the expression mathematical invention. So Jeremy Gray's work is important in that sense. And we see many such contemporary articulations like Alan Badiou's, for example. So Alan Badiou has made this argument famously, I think, in Being an Event, where he has constructed a kind of mathematical ontology, a mathematical ontology where mathematics for Badiou becomes the only way of approaching a pure ontology. By a pure ontology, I mean being qua being, what Badiou calls being qua being. Being in the sense that it is not being in relation to knowing or being in relation to becoming. I mean, there is a question of becoming there in Badiou's philosophy, but let me not go far afield into that. But, someone like Badiou has made this argument about mathematical ontology, which again gives us a different purchase on mathematics through philosophy. Similarly, in a more scientific or in a more scientistic, I should say, discourse, someone like Max Tegmark has talked about the whole reality as mathematical, the structure of human reality as mathematical. When we think of literary studies, I've already mentioned 2 books, but going a little bit further back, Stephen Connor, a major modernist literary scholar, has written a book like Living by Numbers, which is about the importance of number in our everyday lives. Numbers give us pleasure, numbers give us terror sometimes. Numbers have a deep affective relation with our mind. And again, I mean, in psychology, there is something that we call anxious counting. Again, we see examples of this in. Sorry, I can hear an echo, which is very disturbing. Could you please switch off your audio? Anyone who might have their audios on? Thank you. So in Freud's work, for example, there are many examples in both psychopathology of everyday life and interpretation of dreams, where Freud talks about this anxious counting. For example, there's a particular person Freud talks about who always wants to count numbers between his seeing a thunderbolt in the sky, and his listening to the sound of that thunderbolt, because he has this phobia that each time a thunderbolt strikes the sky, it would, strike his house or strike him, and he would be struck dead by it. So because he has this particular fear of death, whenever he sees a thunderbolt in the sky, he automatically starts to count numbers to neutralize that fear. But as Freud says, this develops yet another fear, a different kind of a phobia. So not that numbers can always help, but sometimes in anxiety, in moments of anxiety, we start counting. A classic example is someone who's having difficulties with speech and, starts to back calculate maybe from 100 to 1. I mean, it's one of those cultural practices our parents sometimes have taught us. How do you go to sleep if you can't sleep? Calculate numbers. So these are the kind of questions we address in a humanities approach to mathematics. I mean, again, to give you a reference point for those of you who are interested, recently Caleb Everett, who's a cognitive linguistic, has written a cultural history of numbers. The book is called Numbers and the Making of Us. So again, there are many different ways in which now we are approaching mathematical questions from a variety of humanities perspectives, linguistics, anthropology, literature, and so on. So it's part of a larger movement that we are talking about mathematics in literature. But I'm aware of time, and I don't think I have a lot of time. So let me try and just give you some further pointers before concluding. Mathematics is also interestingly evoked in a lot of literary texts in relation to the human body, the shape and position and posture of human body. Again, we see a lot of this in modernist literature. During discussion, we could open up this question further. Mathematics quite obviously becomes a point of measuring time. So both time and space become very important tropes in literary texts where mathematical forms come in. But I think, in both time and space, mathematics sometimes seems to become this heuristic tool, this tool to explain time and space, but not always and not necessarily. For example, I mean, one could think of clock time and mathematics in that sort of calculative rationality model, where we are talking about measurable time. And then you have the immeasurable time of Marcel Proust, for example, the time of the subject, the time of relativization. There's been some very interesting argument about Einstein's relativity and Proust as a literary relativist of time. And it's interesting that the Tagore Einstein dialogue that I started with that poem of Tagore's, again, has this built into it. In fact, this is the first question Tagore asks Einstein, that you've been mathematically approaching these ancient entities, what he calls the ancient entities of time and space. Again, we could come back to this. We see a lot of this in Calvino's Cosmicomics as well. Calvino's Cosmicomics seems to deploy mathematical forms to envisage these peculiar spaces, like a point, for example, in one of the texts in Cosmic Comics, where Calvino imagines a point, a single point with 0 dimensions, which houses the entire world in a vertical structure. But if that is the case, the point has already become a line, a vertical line with some dimensionality to it. So again, these are very interesting questions, because in modernist art, most famously in Cubism, we see space as mathematical. Kandinsky again is a figure who could be considered very seriously. He has written very detailed tracts on mathematical questions of line and point in relation to art. Form, of course, we know how modernist literature is almost obsessed with reinventing the literary form. And I would argue mathematical forms are built into this question of literary form. When modernist literature, as I've said, appeals to mathematical discourse to create a form which can possibly go beyond realism. But whether or not it can, I've already questioned that. Again, a very important example of the mathematics literature interface in modernism, or late modernism, early postmodernism maybe, is the 1960s French group Oulipo. So again, those of you who are interested could think of Raymond Queneau's work, Raymond Queneau, how Raymond Queneau in a way develops this whole idea of axiomatic literature. So he sees mathematics as being built into literary language, the very structure of a literary text. And he follows primarily the axiomatic mathematician David Hilbert, but this entire group is also extremely interested in another field, which is set theory. I've already talked about Badiou evoking set theory, Derrida evoking set theory. So there's a tradition here, or a historical sequence one could map out, especially in French literature and philosophy, from the 60s onwards. So in 1960, this group is formed. In 1939, the Nicolas Bourbaki book came out. Bourbaki is a group of mathematicians, not one person, and they came up with this book called The Theory of Sets, which became extremely important for someone like Raymond Queneau, talking about the axiomatic aspects of literature. And Oulipians famously developed what they called the constrained method of writing. So someone like George Perec would write an entire novel with a vowel, without a vowel, E. La Disparition, a void, is a novel without the vowel E. So these are constrained methods of writing where mathematics becomes a question of literary method of composition and the structure of the text. But I'm also trying to make this distinction here between mathematics built into language, literary language, structure, and axiom. Of course, there is a fundamental numerical quality to language. I mean, we write in sentences, we put a stop, that's sentence 1. There are, let's say, 5 sentences in a paragraph, 5 paragraphs in a chapter, and so on and so forth. So language is always inherently mathematical. That's one argument. But there is another argument to be made, and that's why I started with Yeats's Statues and Tagore's poem from Kapchara, that mathematics is also a representational content or a trope or a theme in literary texts that we have neglected, at least compared to other themes like politics, society, love, and so on and so forth. And not that mathematics does not have a relation with these other things. You know, we've already talked about the relation between anxiety and counting, which throws open the field of psychoanalysis in a way. So the other point that I would make, and I'll close this conversation with that, we could have questions and answers, of course. Mathematics and affect. Mathematics and affect are, again, I think this is a connection we can make when we go through the question of mathematics in modernist literature by using psychoanalysis as a tool, which is also very much part of the entire modernist culture. So the question of affect is, I think, crucial here. Because when we see the mathematical questions in literary texts, they're not necessarily dry questions of structure. And structure is not a dry question. That's the assumption I'm trying to counter here. These are structures of the body and structures and very deep structures of human affect. And mathematics has a purchase on that. So to give an example, we could, think of a play by Samuel Beckett, Come and Go. It's a very brief play where we have three women talking about some sort of a secret that they can't share with everybody. And one person shares it in turn with another person in a series of three. There's a mathematical patterning of that in the play. But at the end of the play, they all seem to know that secret about the other person. We are not very sure whether all three know all three secrets, but one person knows the secret about the other. So it works in twos rather than in threes, though we have three women there. Now, at the end of the play, they hold hands the way they did in the past. And these are old friends, presumably. The play, in a typically Beckettian way, doesn't give out a lot of details, but there's this haptic dynamic where they hold hands in a very particular topological way. And Beckett diagrammatizes that in his play text. And this is, something that Beckett does quite often. But he insists on this particular topology of an Olympic ring where 1 connects 2 connects 3. And if you take out the median ring, the other two will collapse. But if you take out any of the side rings, the entire structure will not collapse. So it's not what Lacan would call the Borromean knot. And he would go deep into this particular question in his later psychoanalytic teachings. But this is a particular knot that is called Olympic knot in knot theory, where if you take out the median ring, the structure disappears, the structure collapses, but any of the two side rings, well, it's fine. So this is not an equivalent structure. It's not uniform. The median ring is more important that way for the chain than the two side rings. And this corresponds with the mathematical structure of circulation of this particular secret in the play. I know this might be a little bit complicated to understand right off the cuff, but those of you who are interested could go deeper into this particular play as an example. The point I'm trying to make is that these are three women who are deeply affected by some traumatic incident, which they can't even talk about in detail with a certain degree of openness. Their haptic physical structuring, the way they connect with one another, touch each other, hold each other's hands, that takes a mathematical shape. So this is an example where mathematics, body, and affect, all three come together, because the body seems to assume a mathematical structure when one body links with another. And this is something that we see in a lot of modernist literary texts. I did have a mind to go into other examples, but I think I'll cut it short here. I have made the points that I wanted to make, and maybe we could have some questions or some comments. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Da. Thanks for this wonderful presentation, and so many questions we have received, and it shows that how the audience are mesmerized by this talk. And it's a fact that when one will Google the topics like mathematics, psychoanalytics, and modernist literature, the very first book that Google suggests is your book, that is Beckett, Lacan, and the Mathematical Writing of the Real by you, and it is published from Bloomsbury. And I have already shared the link by the book with you all in the thread, also comment thread also. Now let me ask you some questions, and rather those are the observations. And at the same time, welcome Samradda. Samradda is also here in this platform. Welcome, Da. Dada, you can tell also. You can also ask.
Dada, you can tell also.
Hello.
You can also ask.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a very interesting talk. Though I listened to the initial portion through YouTube because there was some disturbance with my software. So I just want to know that the relationship of mathematics with economics and how the discourse of economics appropriates mathematics in a particular way. And even in the discourse of modernism, there is a kind of talking back to the discourse of economics and the capitalist mode in a particular way. So I just want you to comment on this relationship between economics, mathematics, and the literary.
Right. Thank you so much, Amrita.
Thank you so much.
Should I answer the questions as they come or together?
As they come or together?
Yes, you please answer, Dada.
Yes, you please answer, Dada. Okay.
Thank you for that question, Samra. I can hear a feedback. Sorry, because I'm using the phone.
Yeah.
Possibly, if others could mute their microphones, because it's difficult to talk if I can hear my voice. Thank you so much. Okay, I think there's no echo anymore. Right. So, right. I'll use an example, and this is a piece I wrote in the Journal of Humanistic Mathematics on Calvino's short stories. In Numbers in the Dark, which is the titular story of an early collection by Italo Calvino, this particular question comes in, and very significantly, because we're talking about a corporate company, a company that keeps ledgers, and there's a person who works there in the clerical position who talks about this mythological error that one of the earlier accountants made, and as a result of that, all the calculations of that company are wrong. And it's a wonderful kind of almost a Borgesian mythology that Calvino offers there. And with Calvino, we know the connections with the mathematical troping in his writing and his own political positions as well. And this is very clear in the way he uses the mathematical questions, especially in his early parabolic texts. I've written another piece on that, which is forthcoming in Jadavpur University's journal. But to address your question, mathematical modeling often becomes a part of the discourse of economics. But that is exactly the kind of ideological mapping of mathematics that I would like to distance literature from. In fact, and strictly speaking, I'm talking about my interests. I'm interested precisely in the obverse of this, where this kind of a, let's say, mathematical economism is resisted by modernist literature. And I think modernist literature, when it opens up the mathematical question, it opens up the question of the irreducible. I didn't get the time to go there, but that's why I would choose psychoanalysis there, because what Lacan does is to talk about mathematical discourse in relation to a deadlock. So in Lacan's later teachings, the real is mathematically defined as an impasse of formalization. When a formalization reaches a point of deadlock. And when we say formalization, we could talk about a mathematical formalization as well. So that's how Lacan approaches the question of the matheme, what he extracts in a Platonic move from the discourse of mathematics, matheme. And this is how he talks about the letter in his later teachings, where he's talking about the mathematical and material surface of language, where language evokes polyphony through punning, among other things, through this particular register of the pun, which is very important for psychoanalysis, because that's how we associate one word with another, through pun, among other things, of course, but through pun. So I would say, and again, I mean, just to give another example, in James Coetzee's Youth, we have this character who wants to be a mathematician and then gets completely disappointed by his function as an IBM employee. Because again, we are talking about this mathematics being reduced to a calculative rationality model. And that's something that we see in the mobilization of mathematics in economics, where it seems to basically forward a quantitative method, so to speak. But honestly, I'm not really an expert on this particular question of mathematical modeling in economics, and I've not really studied this, but I think we do have a resistance to these calculative rationality maneuvers of mathematics when modernist literature uses mathematics.
Okay, thanks a lot. There is another question, that is, could you please unpack the mathematical and psychoanalytic relevance of the Holy Trinity and its all the position in culture, with specific regard to three being one, and how it gains representational as well as formative value in the Catholic dogma?
This is a wonderful question, but I didn't really go there. So in Jacques Lacan's later teachings, he talks about the unconscious and the three aspects of the unconscious as three Brownian rings. So the mathematical term is Brownian link. It's a Borromean knot. Now, the very interesting quality of this Borromean knot of three rings is that there is no one-on-one rapport. None of the rings is associated in a unary way with another ring, and yet all three make a trinity. And there have been a lot of interesting work that connects Lacan's maneuver with this, what he calls, some sort of a triplicity, this triplicity with Catholic Trinity and so on. One could think of Giorgio Agamben's work. Of course, Agamben doesn't refer to Lacan, but Agamben's work, where he unpacks this very interestingly, this question of, and I'm going back partially to Shamradda's question, this question of oikonomy. Where does the word economy come from? And Agamben goes back to Christian and Judaic religious traditions to talk about this anarchy, where it is a holy trinity, and at the same time it's one. So it's one and three at the same time. And there's a sort of anarchic non-relation between the one and the three. Now, this is structurally equivalent with Lacan's point that in the Borromean knot, in the Borromean chain, there is a one and a three, but the one and the three do not have a relation between themselves. So, I mean, I'll restrict my comments. This is a huge question, and but I would direct the person who has asked the question to Agamben's work and Lacan's work with the Borromean knot and its religious underpinnings, which have been studied now.
Okay. Thanks a lot for your take. There is another question from Pradosh, and you know him also. How does spatial mathematics, like topology and its associated mathematics, pan out when marking out how the discourse of literature expands the horizons beyond rationalistic thinking? This is the first part, and the second part is telling that this is in relation to the broader discussions on quantum mechanics and its associated mathematics on 20th century, especially with the idea of string theory in opening up discussions on dimensionality. What is your take on it?
Again, a big question. Thank you, Pradosh, but a very difficult and big question. So I don't know whether we have the time for this, but let me respond as briefly as possible. So the paradigm of set theory actually brings in this question of space in a very heterogeneous way. The fundamental connection between literature and this would be how literature imagines space. And again, we have some very interesting examples from the Indian tradition as well. I'm remembering a very brief, almost a flash fiction by Shondipan Chattopadhyay, where he, actually gives us a diagram of the space he's talking about in the short story. So space and setting, of course, in literary texts go hand in hand. But how does literature imagine the space of the world that it conjures up? And there, I think we could bring in the question of different mathematical traditions to think about that space. And I would again briefly evoke an interesting sort of example of this that we see. There's a tradition in late modernist, postmodernist literature called transrealism, Rudy Rucker, who's a mathematician by training, has also written a lot of cyberpunk sci-fi novels. He wrote a manifesto called Trans-Realist Manifesto. So in that text and in Rucker's own novels, and Rucker has written on mathematics as well as relativity, there would be a very interesting, again, interplay of this. One final comment on the string theory. We don't really have the time, and I don't think we have the time to go beyond this, but one quick comment. String theory is a very interesting example, because string theory is precisely what mathematics, I mean, though it's in between mathematics and physics in that sense, it's a mathematization of physics which brings us to string theory. But string theory is a great example, because string theory talks about things that we don't know whether they exist or not. And that's precisely the point, where mathematical formalization can reach a certain limit of knowledge. We don't know whether the axioms of string theory can be justified always by a world that exists, where those strings are operative. But we theoretically presuppose those worlds and continue with those strings. So again, that's a wonderful example of mathematics being able to imagine other worlds. And that's again a fundamental connection it has with literature as a medium that wants to imagine other worlds, worlds other than the ones that exist. Thank you.
Dada, my WhatsApp is flooded with so many questions, and you have to be precise now. And everyone is also requesting me to take their question. There is another question, that in epic Mahabharata, we find these mathematical numbers playing a vital role. What is your observation on it?
I can't, honestly, I don't know, because I have not really studied Mahabharata from a mathematical question. But thank you so much. I will look into this. So that's a precise answer. I'm ignorant.
Okay. There is another question, that can we say that a relationship between mathematics and literature is a reflection of materialistic approach to literature, and far more deviated from post-colonial approach to resistant? And as we know that a resistance is a result to oppose the materialism in bourgeois society reflected in literature. What is your take on it?
Again, a very complex question, but a very impressive one. So yes, it depends how we are mobilizing the question of mathematics, but mathematics is not apolitical in literature. So for example, I'll just very quickly give a reference here, because I mentioned that trilogy. So in James Coetzee's School Days of Jesus, what we see, among many other things, of course, is how number becomes attached to the question of identity, and how identity gets reduced to numbers. So David is someone who has come from another world, literally. In for those of you who know the Coetzee novel, you know what I'm talking about. He comes from literally another world, and he does not have his identity papers. So he's not a part of let's say the orgy of democracy, which is the whole idea of electoral counting, and also counting for citizenship. He's not a citizen subject in that sense. And that has a very complex connection with the way the novel pans out the question of the 0 and the 1, which is the beginning of the series of whole natural numbers, what is called whole natural number. So again, one could talk about mathematics, depending on the texts we are talking about, in a political way that could respond to these post-colonial questions as well. But it depends on what context we are talking about, and what texts we are talking about. Yeah.
Can you describe how time itself becomes an inseparable labyrinth, especially in preference to George Louis Borges' writing?
So again, Borges, by the way, there is a book that talks about the Library of Babel and Borges, mathematics in Borges' writing. And the book that I mentioned, this is another book, Bailey Britz's book, also has a chapter on mathematics in Borges. There's a lot of writing on this. So Bailey picks up on this question of infinity as a Kantorian mathematical concept, and how Borges engages with his own imaginations of infinity. But Borges also refers to mathematics, primarily through the references to Kabbalist, traditions of the occult. But I mean, again, it's a huge question. I don't think I can do any justice to this question. And again, we have to very slowly and closely read particular Borges texts to be able to respond to this question. But thank you for that. Yeah.
Do you think that the fact that mathematics can't be an autonomous language and must have a representational aspect is at the same time it is relatable to the frustration of the modernist desire for an autonomous and new language of literature? And
yeah, absolutely. Sorry, go ahead, please. Yeah.
And does this imply the impossibility of stepping outside of the metaphysical tradition of mimetic aesthetics?
Yeah. So I completely agree with that question. Whoever has asked that question has completely got the very gist of what I was trying to say, the spirit of it, that mathematics is a material question, not a metaphysical question. Yes, I think, and that's what we see in writers like Calvino, who talks about the self-enclosure through mathematics. If we read his texts, like the text on cybernetics and the ghosts, and in his other writings, his non-fictional writings, where he talks about mathematics, he's interested in mathematics as this self-enclosed structure. But mathematics cannot offer a self-enclosed structure. So there is a degree of frustration there. But I think what it does is to politicize the question of mathematics. In Badiou, when Badiou talks about mathematical ontology, it's not apolitical by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, Badiou uses mathematical materialism to reimagine the Marxian materialist thesis. So it's deeply political. I mean, in another talk, we could talk about perhaps politics and mathematics. I mean, not today. But thank you so much.
Okay. I'm taking one last question.
Sure,
Does Derrida's coinage of the term like logocentrism and phonocentrism are influenced by his mathematical perspective?
That's again a very interesting question. So when Derrida talks about logos and phonos, and I'm thinking of the earlier work, Voice and Phenomena, where he talks about voice, I don't know whether Derrida explicitly talks about mathematics. I mean, Derrida explicitly talks about mathematics, as I said, of dramatology, in parts of it, in certain texts in acts of literature, in positions. And another text where he does very specifically talk about mathematics is this. I'm just trying to remember. This is a text where, I just lost the cue there, but so when he talks about mathematics in the texts where he does, I don't think he's sort of thinking about that question of phonocentrism and logocentrism, but of course they are related in a way, because when he's talking about pushing language away from logocentrism, there is a certain move towards what he calls the archaic trace. And the archaic trace, with its materiality, this is not a claim he makes explicitly, by the way, I'm reading him in a way, this archaic trace that Derrida talks about could be considered mathematical in a certain way. So that's where I was going with that, Derridean idea of inscription as mathematics. But then he refers to, for example, Gödel and the impossibility theorem in completeness theorem in many texts, and he uses set theory. He uses these topological shapes like invagination of edges, for example. So I mean, there's a lot perhaps that can be done with Derrida in mathematics, but hasn't been done. So that would be an interesting area of research. Thank you.
Okay. And so I have one observation that is regarding the psychoanalytical part of it. As we know that it is some kind of interaction between unconscious and conscious, and it is one of the prime goals of psychoanalysis. So to some extent, can we interpret it with Fabio Herman's field theory and Wolfgang Isert's theory of aesthetic response? And can we relate it with your mathematical
Yeah, I
term?
mean, again, yeah, that will be interesting. So there is, of course, in literary criticism, when Iser and others, and also Booth to a
Yes.
certain extent, Wayne Booth, when they talk about structures, there are sort of interesting references to mathematics here and there. They don't really go deep into that. But to respond to your question, it's not really an answer. It's an interesting question. But one response is, in Lacan, especially the later teachings of Lacan, the unconscious is mathematized to a certain extent, but not mathematized as a complete mathematical form. In fact, that's precisely the point. In later Lacan, the unconscious is real, which means it is not necessarily a symbolic unconscious, the unconscious that is structured like a language, as he would say in his earlier teachings. The unconscious here is like a depletion of that language. And let's say mathematics is not a meta language in Lacan. He makes this point very clearly in Seminar 20, Encore. Mathematics is not a meta language, but mathematics offers us these limits of knowledge and the deadlock or the impasse to a formalization. And that's where the real is. If the unconscious is real, the unconscious has to go through these mathematical structures of language, but then there is an exit point. There's a point out of this mathematical structure where the mathematical structure is haunted by an impasse. And that's where I think, this becomes interesting for literature, where mathematics is used against itself, not as an autonomous, complete, absolutist discourse, but a fragmented discourse in modernism.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Arkoda, for taking time from your busy schedule today. And we want to let you know that we are very much excited about this opportunity to dive into this kind of academic atmosphere created by you. And we think that it has exceeded the expectation of the listeners also. And seeing the comments, it seems so. And your talk was particularly appropriate at the time when we are also considering a new initiatives or approaches to read text in this way. Many of us are especially interested in your mathematical analysis of literary resources available to you, and at the same time reading those can sustain our collective growth. And so we believe that you can make yourself available for any further academic discussions or interactions on part of our institution.
Sure.
Again, thank you
So
for your
my
time and consideration.
email is online and anyone can email me. That's absolutely fine. Thank you so much for organizing this, Gautam, and your colleagues as well. I mean, you've put in a lot of effort to organize this, and in this very difficult times, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be talking to all of you.
And thanks to Samrat also. Samrat, thanks for joining us.
And the question and answers were really stimulating. Mathematics was not really a favorite subject with many of us literature students. And your reading of mathematics from humanizing mathematics actually opened up new doors and new possibilities in mathematical humanism as a new research discipline. And probably we'll all go home and reread texts in this light in a newer way that you have provided to us in your very lucid and very beautiful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. And bye. See you all.
Bye. See you.
Bye.
Thanks for this. Bye. Okay. So now.
Is our speaker already there, Gautam?
Yes.
Okay.
Sangyupta, you are there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hear
Yes.
me?
Please. Yes. Yes, Sirupati, please go ahead.
Hello. Oh, that was a very splendid presentation by Dr. Orko Chattopadhyay. We have as our third speaker today Dr. Sanjukta Ghosh, who is the Artistic Director of the School of Oriental and African Studies, South Asia Institute in United Kingdom. As an Artistic Director of SWAS South Asia Institute, she has been involved with partnerships, conceptual planning, and production of numerous cultural events that have received national and international media coverage. She is a Commonwealth Scholarship-funded doctorate in modern history from SWAS Department of History, Religion and Philosophy, where She has been a senior teaching fellow. Among major research projects, she has worked on the Routledge series on partition, the ERC project on infrastructure development in South Asia, the Heritage Lottery Fund project on the East India Company, and recently completed the volume Memory, Identity and the Colonial Encounter, Fifth Script for Professor Peter Robb, that was launched at the Royal Asiatic Society and the Indian History Congress. She is a research network member of the European Social Science History Conference, Fellow of South Asia Democratic Forum, and a Fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland. Currently, she is involved with the AHRC project under the rubric Cultural Heritage, Migration and Indian Diasporas, a BAFTA-nominated South Asian film project, GCRF project on indigenous food systems, among other government-level research consultancies. She has peer-reviewed publications in South Asian history. Today, she'll be speaking on the topic Reincarnations of the Bengal Famine, Literature and Memory. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and also many thanks to Gautam, particularly to invite me for this wonderful session of South Asia related topics, which concerns literature most of the time. I think I was briefly listening to the previous speaker, and I'm very sorry I couldn't stay for the rest of the conference, but I was absolutely enthralled to see how you're really bringing in intersections of methods as well as different subjects and different interdisciplinary approaches to studying English literature. I mean, I must confess that I'm a historian here, and I have obviously used some literary texts in the presentation of the history of the Bengal famine of 1943, which is an extremely over-researched area, considering you're all familiar with the seminal text that stems from Bengal, Professor Amartya Sen's phenomenal work on the Bengal famine. So when I started this project in my head, I first thought that how do we look at the Bengal famine in a way slightly not deviating from the way Professor Sen's work is, but really engaging with how famine is linked to reading some of the popular culture associated with it, as well as the literary texts that are associated with the famine. So, I mean, this topic that I've devised is about reincarnations of the Bengal famine, literature and memory being the key words in the title. So I think in the introduction, there's a mention of Professor Peter Robb's Festschrift, which I can show you is just beside me. And I wanted to show everyone on screen that there is this volume by Routledge, Memory, Identity, and the Colonial Encounter in India, which was launched in the Indian History Congress a few years ago, as well as in the Royal Asiatic Society here. And there are some very interesting discussions around it, for which you're most welcome to listen to the podcast in the Royal Asiatic Society. So the interesting thing about this volume is, again, to look at the historiography of memory studies that relate to Indian historiography, and with very specific reference to partition is what has been the main frame. But to go beyond that and connect memory studies with issues of identity questions and look at a wide canvas of literature around it is a way of breaking away from some of the stereotypes of how memory studies should be interpreted as well. So that's there in the book. And there's a large section on historiography of memory as well, which I don't want to go into today because it's quite complex and time consuming as well. So I want to just very briefly start off by saying that, when people think of memory, It's more of a personal, psychological phenomena. And yet memory can be social, collective, and historical, as well as individual and personal. And we're obviously reminded of Maurice Holbach's work in the 1930s, where the term collective memory was noted to denote something that is special, something that comes out of society. And social identities were considered to be essentially stable, something that is determined, and it's fundamentally identity which has an important role in shaping memory rather than the other way around, of remembering and then creating the social identity. So this brings us to the question of, how do we retrieve memory from the past? And this question is becoming increasingly important in today's context as well, when we are faced with various debates about how we preserve statues and whether statues should fall, etc. So there is a wide consensus that memory is therefore actively constituted in the present, and it is constantly restructured by contemporary perspectives too. So social memory is definitely shaped by some present interests, and in South Asia as well as in other parts of the world, we do know that history and memory are all too often deployed in the service of politics, of course. Particularly it relates to, say, community identities and community politics as well. So this connection is therefore linked with the politicization of memory, and politicized memory crosses over very often into the process of myth making. All this sounds quite difficult and controversial, but there is a process of myth making that goes on in society, and you've got to really see how the two things are not the same, and we need to understand the various boundaries of it. So there is really an emergence of loads of works now that propose that there could be different ways of imagining the past and produce alternative narratives that are therefore critical to, as well as crucial, to determine what is the alternative theory and narrative that is the violence of the more scientific histories that we are very used to. So in contrast to this desire to memorialize and remember the colonial encounter, we do find that colonialism is something that must be remembered, urgently remembered, or vividly remembered. I mean, these talks are becoming quite common now in study circles as well as outside those study circles. So, I mean, the way colonialism is remembered is, there are certain standard ways where we do have sculptures, we do have statues in outskirts of major cities in India. And currently there are statues that are there in different parts of the UK that is linked to the colonial enterprise all over the world. And we identify those statues, namely, most importantly, in the context of the Bengal famine, to Winston Churchill, of course. And Winston Churchill's statue stands as if it is something to cling on to and remember. And so some current films have, I mean, probably the film already, which I don't want to spill right now. I'm going to come to the end of it. But it doesn't matter. It's Bengal Shadows, really, that ends with this kind of clinging on to Winston Churchill's statue, sending out the message that he never really saw the Bengal famine could have been averted, even though food could be supplied to people, and even in the more scarce areas that were demarcated. So what I'm trying to say is that this whole memory making process, say for instance, remembering Churchill is very much part of the famine narrative. It's always been, and it still is. So the way we remember the past is also the way we are imagining things in the present, and we continue to link up with the present. So this kind of a past-present dialogue is there in the context of the Bengal famine as well, right now. So sculpture is, of course, one example, but we also have other more formidable structures of memory. For instance, there are roads, there's buildings, there's colonial heritage, etc., is linked to how we remember certain incidents, certain events, like the Calcutta Black Hole tragedy, the Amritsar massacre, and the Bengal famine. You know, these are all kind of interlinked in some ways, that there is this whole question of the Amritsar massacre currently in the public domain, and whether an apology has been rendered towards it, or how we then deal with Bengal famine, this constant reference point in the current political discourse as well. So there's these particular events that need to be remembered in history, and the significance of preserving select colonial artifacts and analysis of particular events in retrospect, therefore, brings out some kind of complexities as to not just about evolving historical memories, but how we actually analyze these various specific events. And in this context, we are talking about food, which is very rooted in the whole discourse of the famine, and the importance of memory in the study of food. So memory, that is to say, in which an individual or a collectivity constructs their past, is therefore a crucial factor for researching the history and the culture of food as well. Because food consumption practices have been represented through, say, photography, art, exhibitions, and theaters, to evoke some kind of civic actions. And it forges, therefore, a kind of colonial identity that's of a very conscientious consumer citizen, for instance. So the ethics of consumerism, etc., as social practices that are inclined towards social services, relates to social responsibility, social citizenship, and is defined through food security measures. So research into these kind of practices during the phase of decolonization, which is a very current topic as well, reveals the extent and the nature of civil protests against hunger. So I'm going to really, towards the end of the paper, bring out the importance of, therefore, the connection between literature and reading into memory, and therefore defining its importance in relation to these kind of understanding the role of civil protests in finding the causation of famine as well. The importance of these protests stretch, therefore, beyond the more standard analytical frameworks of either nationalist or anti-colonial struggles, for instance. So drawing from the historiography, of course, there'll be lots more questions that I'm going to have to relate to towards the end. But at the moment, I want to start off by looking at, I think I'm able to share some slides as well, if I do share.
Yes, yes, please. Yes. You can.
So what do I press? Do I press a share screen?
Share screen. Yes.
Okay, and then
You have to open the slides in the background at first. You have to open the slide or the PPT in the background, and then you have to go to share screen.
I have it's actually opened already, so I don't know why you can't. Oh, you can see now, it seems. Share, I'm putting share.
Yes.
I'm back now,
Yes,
but
yes.
I can't seem to.
Now, no, this not the one.
Okay, it doesn't matter. I just don't want to make it too complicated here. If you just put me back on the screen, I'm just going to keep to a very, maybe I don't know how to do in the background, so we haven't tried this. But I just want to start off by looking at the discussion that I was doing earlier, which is to look very specifically on how I'm interpreting this whole famine discourse and how I'm linking it up with the background literature. So the research that I've done is really, it draws on the intellectual fervor that resulted from James Scott's publication, The Moral Economy of the Peasant, Rebellion and Subsistence in Southeast Asia, that brought out and focused on the everyday life of the peasant to comprehend their stakes in rural society. So Scott's argument was really in favor of a grand design of the Asian school of scarcity and risk, which warranted a scrutiny to look at the obligatory roles of the national elite to safeguard the grain producer in times of distress in the context of subsistence rights. Now, this research confirms that such an explanation of a societal response to economic distress is restricted to the norms of subsistence expectations, with no bearing on what, say, Paul Griner's work on Bengal famine shows, the cultural meaning of subsistence and its varied implications. So interrogating this cultural sphere of subsistence, therefore, enables us to challenge the more normative aspects of peasant resistance. And linked with that is, of course, the patron-client relationships and the village-level relationships of dependence in uncertain times. And I want to I wish I could show the slides, but it doesn't matter if you don't actually follow the argument. I can always stop at some point and go back on any points that you would like me to raise before. So I want to come to the production and the consumption of rice as a key area of the research, which I describe as an important area of economic activity that is also intimately linked with the social and the religious duties as embodied in Bengal's textual as well as oral traditions. So if you study in this context, the changing meanings of rice in the context of the Bengal famine, the food supplies and the relief operations, it's quite easy to see the changing nature of the subsistence mechanisms that work based on the economic and the cultural expectations that surrounds the production and the consumption of rice in the Bengal countryside. So really the famine of 1943, just to recoup the historical background to those who are familiar with the story but would like to really touch on the more nuanced historical arguments, I want to sort of recap very quickly that it was, for Bengal history, the last major historical event of horrific deaths resulting from starvation and hunger, affecting nearly 3 million people in every part of undivided Bengal, with far-reaching effects on the neighborhood areas. So food availability decline, which FAD or food availability decline, is related to natural disasters such as the damage to the Aman or the Kharif rice crop, both due to the tidal waves and a disease epidemic, war, and breakdown of legal entitlement, have been demarcated as the key historical explanations of the 1943 Bengal famine, in addition to talking about British policy, responsibilities of individuals on the field, Churchill's role, and of course, diversion of food to the British Army. So Amartya Sen's seminal study, it does a few things, and it shifts the focus of the causes of famine from a kind of a Malthusian perspective of a decline in food availability to poverty and entitlement. So in this landmark work, which is also something he uses his own life experience of the famine as the intellectual background to this groundbreaking analysis, which is something I want to also emphasize here when we talk of literature and the power of documentation, that he uses this analysis to demonstrate the importance and the primacy of controllable social, economic, and political factors over the environmental or the natural factors in precipitating famine. That's definitely the ceiling point here. There's no way you can deviate from that. So widespread hunger is rarely accounted for by sheer lack of sustenance, and famine-stricken countries have often sort of shown that sufficient food or money for imports to provide for populations. But there are definite economic circumstances that lead to impoverishment and want. So Sen's estimate and his entitlement crisis, which is of course one of the principal causes of the famine, implies the breakdown of socioeconomic conditions that favor the peasants' legitimate claim to food, was also, as we know, is the crisis point of Bengal's morality to cope with the dramatic transformation of what was known as the Sonar Bangla or the Golden Bengal. So coming back to rice, it always represents an idea of well-being in Bengal that is expressed not only in material terms, but in terms of the symbols that govern sharing of food. So apart from fulfilling the basic needs, rice meets the instrumental needs of placating gods, funerary rites, that is widely used in the rituals. So it is therefore tied to a very basic social grammar of Bengal, where value judgments are placed based on the basic need of someone and his ability to fulfill the needs of others. So in rural society, the production as well as the consumption of rice therefore forms the core element of the peasant's subsistence. It's an area of economic activity that is therefore intimately linked with the socio-religious duties as well. And that is something that literature as well as oral traditions and other historical traditions will definitely testify. So just a very brief example of the colonial literature during the period would be the phenomenal study of W. Hunter's work, which is really a statistical study of Bengal. And he notes the very solid preparations of rice in those accounts, most of which were meant for domestic consumption rather than as marketable commodities. And we find through these very elaborate descriptions that Hunter actually even bothers to give in his text, he's talking about the processing of rice into sweetmeats, cakes, and other preparations, giving emphasis to how rice has been stored in Bengal. When boiled rice was not available, or to stock up for periods of temporary shortage and in times of poverty, he gives quite an elaborate list of these kind of preparations. And any depletion of food stock during the famine meant, therefore, not just the harvested grain, it also meant depletion of the stock or the bhandar, the household. So the bhandar was often used in the literary text as a sign of not only abundance, as Paul Greneau has suggested, but it's also one of stock. And that stock during times of food shortage included not just rice, but also the substitutes, also the very byproducts that has already been documented by the British officials. So they are very much aware of the dependence of these byproducts and the importance of these byproducts as well as in rural life. And those were shared in a certain way by family members during community feasts, during festivals, during travel. And these are all accounted. So what I'm trying to say is that the layering of knowledge about food in Bengal is very much in a lot of detail than how it is portrayed, that rice is the only thing that was short in supply. So the details exist, and we don't actually hear much about these substitutes because the main grain rice is absent here. But no one is talking about how these substitutes could have played a role in sustenance. That is something that is there in the literature, but not so much in the colonial literature as such. By this time of 1943, way before that, we have seen that the market has penetrated in the production of rice, is definitely remaining integrated to the small peasants' subsistence needs, but commercial decision-making is quite important with rice consumption. And a range of intermediate interests in the rice trade had sort of evolved. And this kind of intermediary interests in the rice trade with varying proportions of share in the marketing of rice and its products is very much known as well. So beyond this domain of domestic consumption, subsistence-oriented peasants were therefore willing to take advantage of the marketable rice or the bajarit. Bajarit chal is something that we keep hearing in the texts as well, that is reserved for the market. And the demand and the value of this bazar's rice, bearing the name of the locality, etc., that it was grown, is very much linked to various commercial interests as well as commercial places. Distinctions of different names of rice appears in the texts, which then gives you the connections with all the intermediary interests in the village trade as well. So the transformation of rice is therefore extremely well documented in terms of being an intimate commodity of subsistence, which is what is always associated with when you talk of scarcity, within the hierarchies of the village and the household, to becoming a remote, marketable commodity, which means that the meanings of rice, the meanings of scarcity associated with rice was also constructed and construed outside the formal relations of dependence as well. So rice cultivators remained alert towards climate-induced risk factors such as cyclones, drought conditions, but economic dislocation of village labor from the ritual practices of rice hulling, compounded with the 1943 famine and the Second World War, presenting different range of obstacles. So the usual mechanism of averting starvation during disasters did not work as planned, did not work entirely. So therefore, this whole idea of the man-made famine years not only heightened the rice supply crisis, but it also added to the socioeconomic problems of starvation. Rice, as the mainstay of the village economy, was not only scarce, but its deprivation is a cause of moral and social decay. So with this, I think it's quite important to look at how the relationship, the moral economy that is based on the benevolence of the patron, that is the Annadatta, and the loyalty of the Pishya, that is the dependent, proves to be inadequate in extreme cases of survival. So we do see that with the 1943 famine, there are some clear shifts in the way the fear plays in the public mind about food supplies. And there are lots of ambiguous explanations for food shortage that continue to plague the relief ethos through the worst months of the famine. So rice, which ordinarily remained within the village subsistence arrangements, began to be transported through various commercial channels, and outsiders started to claim a much larger proportion than the usual stored rice, while peasants often thronged to the hearths without prior exposure to purchasing grain. So simultaneously, there was a pervasive black market that emerged in rice that's springing up in villages, towns, and cities, and evading the normal price constraints as well. There's a whole range of study about the urban networks and the new interest groups that emerged. And these comprised of rationing, controlling of goods. But it's important to see how the city, which is represented in the famine literature quite a lot, is drawn into a complex bargaining network. And the various versions of food shortage are sort of churned out through appropriation of famine events to their own advantage. And this is where I think I'm going to have to quickly look at, with the rise in these kind of claims and counterclaims of rice shortage, we want to quickly look at the political climate that is equally important, in which this kind of propagandist literature is playing an important role. The political climate of rumor mongering, promises and secrecy of the administration, and press propaganda of the 1943-44 famine unfolded. So maybe some of you have heard the name Wallace Rudel Ackroyd, who is a member of the Famine Inquiry Commission. He found it even hard to describe the year 1943 as a famine year. He was more at ease with the euphemism of food shortage, but had also alerted to the moral breakdown of the city's administrative control of the food situation. And with him, the British Secretary of State, for instance, Ellis Amery, he made speeches in the Parliament using other invented euphemisms, such as food situation, from a long cabled text, avoiding the words and descriptions such as starvation, cholera, or corpse. Ian Stephens, covering in the British Statesman, wrote in detail about the authorities' shameful and deliberate efforts to conceal or underplay the facts of famine, implying the discursive control of famine in lieu of an objective and practical solution. So as an example of such discursive mediation, a government survey during this time had revealed that 1.076 million people were destitute after the famine year, and whose survival depended solely on the charity of others. Premendra Mitro, I want to quote him here since this is a literary forum, who wrote and described the new urban species as like men, or not quite like them, more like terrible, grotesque caricatures, yet they move and talk and gather like garbage in the streets, in a stupor in the piles of offal, pleading for the dregs of rice. So instead of pursuing blatant acts of organized violence against hunger, destitute migrants resorted to scavenging, begging rice, and the spectacle of which proved to be a living nightmare for the urban rich. Portrayals of such desperation became a recurrent theme in what I collectively call the Bengal famine literature, that also represented the political campaign for food in the post-famine years, well into the 50s, and as I will say, definitely beyond. And the importance of that is what we are heading in this talk. Just wanted to also quickly describe a little bit of the literature around this famine migrants that emerged, which I would say that the Bengal's social memory of famine and relief had done something by then. It definitely pushed the intellectual framework of sustaining food production to a more clearly envisaged, bounded Indian economy with a higher degree of self-sufficiency. And various meanings of rice that emerged during famine as a result of artificial food shortage could send out the complex social messages representing collective responsibility to resolve hunger, but without warranting a homogeneous solution among different social groups. So those concerned later in the Grow More Food campaign, or much later in the 60s even, they were very much within that fold where the urgency that was evident in the changing semiotics of rice had called for a rights-based strategy by then. And therefore, food became quite a crucial component in national planning and further programs of public consultations leading to later to the Communist Party propagandas of the 1960s. There's very good work already on the collective documentation of the food movement in the 59 and the 60s as well. But it's important to look at the development of these in the context of the growing middle class consciousness towards famine relief, which was torn between the individual moral responsibility and the contesting political agendas of the party activists as well. So changes in the middle class consciousness was due to the specter of crowded buses and a sense of insecurity and confusion, beggary and panic hoarding, Calcutta blackout, as if it was a land of anguish, and there was a sense of guilt. You know, there was this, as if Calcutta had become this Aparadh Puri, as if there's all darkness around it. And I mean, I'm sure there are various novels that we can look into here, but essentially it was about political agendas, party activism, that begins to show in characters in, say, for instance, in Pratibimbo of Manik Bandyopadhyay, Tarak leaves his village to come to the city in search of employment. And city middle class and their consciousness towards the neighbor had changed considerably. In fact, the difference between the Bhadralok and the Chotalok seems to be highly differentiated and sharply delineated in many of the stories and the characters that we can talk of as well. So there is this particular term that I'm going to have to use in the context of how the formation of the famine literature, as I call it, represents the Samajwadi consciousness. And this is something that Tanika Sarkar has worked on in Savitri Roy's Harvest Song, which indicates a structure of beliefs and sensibilities in social welfare that was non-partisan in its fundamental approach. So while we do have the political parties and the propagandas, we also get quite a bit of core material on the development and the representation of the Samajwadi consciousness, which is the famine-generated literati were able to communicate in their works elements that were filled with extreme pessimism, decadence, mistrust, irresponsibility of the looming human tragedy through images and text. So they distinguished between the outward manifestations of famine and the inner contradictions among the government officials and the social elite, which I have already described in some details in the previous sections. But the historical processes involved in assembling famine images and coding it for an audience required configuring the famine artifacts, you know, bowls of rice, half-eaten dead bodies, empty golas, sheds for grain storage, shriveled up breasts, and so on. It provided a kind of a critique of wartime urban corruption and material greed. And these were effectively cultural reference that were adapted by contentious urban constituencies to promote a social and a moral struggle against famine. So methodologically, I have used in my work the examples and the characters that shaped the relationships and personal values in both societal and familial settings. And I've tried to develop this to show the transitions in the thinking behind what and how famine had affected not just their individual lives, their family, their own hunger, but how it also affected their neighborhood, their immediate village, their migration to the cities. And therefore, the sense of a collective guilt, a collective responsibility also emerges. And towards the end, I want to also say that this shaping of famine texts and the temporal significance of famine texts is quite important, because many of these were first-hand oral testimonies. Nature of it was often personal memoirs, photographs, genres representing even real theaters that cut across documentary and fictional narratives. So together, the value of historical collection and personal collection represent an attempt to put together ingredients for a public memory of the Great Bengal famine that continued to haunt the post-colonial generation in the early years of Indian independence, including the harrowing tales of displacement, immigration, and crisis across the geographical areas that now constitute Bangladesh. So in the literature on famine, rice was transformed from a symbol of rural prosperity into a famine food of last resort, resembling the debris of vacuous life that was easily disposable. And rice acquired a very different substitutive nutritional value in lieu of its other manufactured byproducts that I gave you descriptions of, say in Hunter's catalog and others, when it was charitably served as fan. That is, it's a starchy leftover. This concept that, you don't have to always just eat rice, but you could do with some byproducts of it, was very much replicated in many of the source stories. And this is something that is also part of how we remember famine, that most people were not really wanting the rice, but they were wanting the fan. And this is something gets legitimized in the texts and images as well. That is the starchy leftover water in which rice is cooked that is wasted or disposed by the well-to-do. There's this kind of a disposability of the human as well as the food that the human can take is there in the stories running in the newspapers or in the texts as well. So a newly concocted gruel, therefore, replaced grain, and the latter available only through control shops to the privileged classes. Hence, gruel could not be quantified, and demands over it could not be fixed, so that appropriate protests could be organized, say, in times of shortage, because you could probably quantify, the economic statistics quantified the rice and the amount, but you couldn't actually quantify how much fan was disposed and how much was given out. So the usual picture of migrants relate to those who dragged themselves from the villages to Calcutta, dropping inert, perhaps in front of well-stocked shops, and there would be plaintive cries, "Pandau, Pandau," echoing the city's lanes. And this kind of cries for fan resonated in the city and descended into the general chaos of barking lay dogs, yielding an eclectic mix of emotion, often disgust, empathy, vacant, and repetitious acts that needed no direct attention. So although the disposable grail satiated the hungry, it had neither any substantial nutritional value nor served as a symbolic gesture of charity. The serving of fan outside the house from relief counters or by the roadside was seen some kind of a routine way of averting an encounter between the privileged urban dweller and the visually horrific distressed. So the plaintive cries for fan is something that becomes in the textual analysis of rice, an object of scarcity, it provided a different angle to the politics of survival, as opposed to the more normative value of rice as an item of sustenance that was promoted by government relief efforts. And politically influential plays like Bijan Bhattacharya's Nabanno, New Harvest, in 1944, deals with an exemplary situation that was put on stage by the Indian People's Theatre. And the play had acquired an iconic status in popular protests among the communists, and it was reenacted with live improvisation in the rural scene, dealing with such situations as well. I do have an article on the urban changes that famine conditions brought about. And I mean, for short of time, there is this book that was published, which is the Stormy Decades of Calcutta, that was edited by Tanika Sarkar and Shekhar Bandyopadhyay. So it has one of my articles there on the urban changes and the urban context of this kind of shift in the way vacuous life was being represented through various characters and through various complex texts, like particularly Bhavani Bhattacharya's. I would want to mention this, like He Who Rides a Tiger, where the negligible substitute fan and the disposable gruel exposes the hollowness of legal entitlements and relief operations. And it shows how the protagonist, for instance, in Bijan Bhattacharya's work, after foraging relentlessly for food and selling his tools, he joins the hungry masses in the city to fetch the rice or the gruel. So he has to fetch the rice, and this kind of an attempt to fetch is to commence a new moral and a new political journey as well. So I don't want to go into a lot of details about these textual analysis, because we also have to keep to some time here. But there's also a lot of emphasis on representation of bodily annihilation that leads to search for food in the city. And it appears as a very deep-seated conflict between the matter and meaning, which structures the relationship between food, hungry bodies, and morality and corruption in the narrative. And rice is very much illustrated as if it's part of women. Women are almost illustrated as clinging on to the achol or the sari, and that's the last bit of cloth that covers their breast to gather some rice, which is meant for the dying and the feeding child. So these kind of images continuously are shown and played up as well, which shows how rice from this women's achal symbolizes the last resort of survival. And it exhausts that stock that we were talking about before in the discussion, that last grain of stock, not just the bhandar in terms of the real rice, but even the byproducts, even those little things like muri or the last grain is something that they wanted to hold on to. And that the fact that it's the last morsel and the fact that it's a kind of a last resort is something that is very much brought out to show whether this is some kind of a point of compromise for the women who want to give up and sell their own bodies to acquire that rice. So the grain is designated often as impure and filthy, as if it's in content like the women's saleable body in a certain form. And queuing up for the gruel kitchen for some rice in the city's relief camp was viewed in immoral terms, as it would be to stand in the queues for prostitution or surreptitiously visit the city's rice contractors. So in other words, rice, denoted as the intimate household commodity of subsistence, in this context of migration and travel, as I had discussed with the journey of Carlo, for instance, became a remote commodity that had to be fetched through the manipulations in different urban circumstances, dissociates the value of rice from its very moral and emotional underpinnings. And this is played out in various urban sites as well, like the Langar Khana, where rice is given out to people. There are distinctions as to who could be offered the rice between communities, between caste communities, Brahmins versus Muslims, and so forth, and how the identity of the person also is changing with the way the survival politics is played out. So we're nearly coming to a lot of, to the, almost like we've covered quite a large ground here as to how the value and the different meanings are being construed with the survival politics that is associated with the 1943 man-made famine. And these changes become clearer by studying the way poverty itself is represented in popular culture with the distinct aim to gain some kind of political mileage. Now, in Bengal's famine literature, rice is therefore intrinsically associated with the causality of distress, with implications under famine conditions. The period between 40 to 50 saw a crucial transformation in Bengal's politics and culture, with a distinct contribution of the communist writers who were not necessarily influenced by the propaganda of their political parties, but poets, theatre personalities, artists, and novelists all rallied to provide a graphic testimony of the famine victims, whose pictures were repeatedly used as a metaphor to evoke emotional responses in famine campaigns. I mean, these writers have also been studied independently and their works, but what I'm trying to do here is to give some kind of a dimension and purpose to the development of famine literature and famine art, and give some kind of an importance to the the importance of representing this kind of poverty in popular culture and what it did to remembering famine, to actually ingraining some ingrained images of famine that stayed on in the making of film, and how we therefore remember it. I mean, there's a whole list of painters and writers which we could go into, talk about publication of Darkening Days on the Famine in 1944, where there's sketches and books on a matter of conscience, for instance, artists bear testimonies and witnesses to the Great Bengal Famine. There's a lot of publications on through the All India Students Conference in 1944, where 30 works around the theme of famine, some by artists like Ashit Haldar, J.P. Gangopadhyay, Indra Dugar, Adinath Mukhopadhyay, and a whole range of artists who were foundational and important, bringing in their kind of experimenting with new materials of art and sketches, mediums of expressions through the kind of inks and the sketches they used to transcend the knowledge of famine that was strictly popular, but at the same time political, but also attaining a broader humanism that is timeless as well as cross-cultural. So, and in most of these works, we do find various fluid symbols of famine-related poverty, an empty pot of rice being a significant referent in both art and literature that fueled the representation of poverty in popular culture, keeping it distinct from the official interpretation of famine as merely a shortage of food supply. So in famine literature, hunger was associated with a popular contempt against corruption that revealed the different scalar implications of poverty, modes of survival, social differentiation within the regimes of corruption, and how these distinctions were embedded in the cultural milieu. So narrative and artistic representational strategies were in place, I think, that shows some kind of a complex entanglement of both the empowered urban groups like the elite and the high caste, the party workers and press, and the disenfranchised immigrants around issues of survival. And understanding, therefore, the famine's causes and consequences by focusing on the semiotics of rice, therefore, enables us to understand the fundamental importance of a language in determining social relations, identities, and the tensions that arise from it. So the discursive investment of the literati to support hunger campaigns was dictated by their humane response to the urban reality of poverty. And a dialectical relationship between hungry bodies and culture therefore emerged with signs and systems that were linked to the world of substance. And images of hunger and shortage of rice therefore dominated the construction of a visual specimen of famine bodies and faces of the destitute, affecting the minds and souls of those who were sheltered from the plight. Rice acquiring a symbolic meaning in urban social consciousness of a literal starvation that kind of coexisted with the construction and the construal of that starvation. In the same way as quiescence endangered by physical debilitation of the migrant famine victim coexisted with the mental suffering and the weaknesses of the famine. So that we do have a lot of emphasis on, even Communist Party activists like B.C. Joshi. He did write quite a lot on his own experience being an urban middle class in the city. And the artistic repertoire as a matter of conscience in Nikhil Charkar's ending note about the nature of artistic repertoire, it attracts the proposition of evaluating these as instruments of famine memory. And its representation in post-colonial films, literary and photographic memoirs, popular literature and art for posterity as well. And many of these famine artifacts will carry the tag of nostalgia, and the weight of their description would be nothing short of a romanticized or a simplified popularization of history that captured the essences of the Bengal famine in terms of peasant victimhood, of an inhuman trauma. And it could be also quite selective, as if it's a kind of a psychological analysis of the realm of Shonar Bangla and breaking it down. So there could be a whole range of texts that play around what could be the cause of famine and how it impacted on people as well. And so these, and of course, I've mentioned about IPTA and the role it played and how Nobanno, the way Nobanno was interpreted in, say, Abedin's image when he painted his own work is also in line with Bijan Bhattacharya's representation of the harvest and Nobanno in his plays. So between play as well as the new art that emerges, we do see these kind of shifts of characters and shifts in the way famine literature in the public realm plays out. I want to also show a short film that I want to, is it possible, Gautam, to look at Akale Shandane as the last?
Yes, yes, I'm trying.
Show that clip that I had chosen to talk about the continuities in the post-colonial literature in terms of memory, and then end with the recent film on Bengal shadows.
Yes, I'm trying.
Quite a great thing to do.
Is it showing?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
What's the sound? Is the sound coming?
Yes, it's coming.
Oh, I can't hear. So.
No, actually, we are not able to hear the sound.
Huh? It's not audible?
No, 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 it's not audible.
It's not audible.
No. Just try to put the volume up. And
It's fully 100%, and here also it is showing speaker of headphone. It's 98. It's 100%. It should be audible. I don't know. Let's begin. Audible?
Not very loud,
Is
but yeah, it's audible. But
I mean,
not
the people
very
are very
loud.
familiar with this anyway. So I think the subtitle.
very loud. It's very loud. Okay.
Not
Now
loud. Not loud.
not loud. Okay, let it. Yes, please do.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
So I wanted to show this clip because I was just going to connect that how similar post-colonial trends can be found in the way artistic enterprises mediated a social memory of Bengal famine, and that's really the concluding part here. And by forcefully engaging with the symbolic value of rice in relation to more generic notions of rural poverty. There's also another particular scene in Akale Shandhane where I described, how the woman holds on to the achal of her sari, and the actress brings the rice in her achal, and then the husband forces her to throw the rice away because it implies that she may have acquired it by selling her own body to get the rice. And that kind of continues in Mrinal Sen's Akale Shandhane, In Search of Famine. And in the film itself, you can see that that was made in 1983. He integrates these varied sensibilities of a memory of famine. And in the film, Sen searches for a woman's face to depict the disillusions representative of a victim of the Bengal famine of 1943, as if that face was quite important, that exactly kind of fitted into how the 1943 famine should have been, the right kind of face. He was looking for that face towards the not towards the end, but often that was the search as well, and that's the part of Akale Shandhane as well. Not just Akale Shandhane, but the face of the Akar as well, represented in the woman's face. But in doing so, decades later, he ended up portraying similar malnourished bodies and faces as examples of poverty, drawing from a relatively contemporary experience of village life and the complexities of social relations. So in his film, the 1943 atypical famine victims face mingled with the millions existing in rural poverty, disease, and hunger, representing the continuity of the famine structure. In Sen's film, therefore, a woman's struggle to keep her household running is depicted by demonstrating the way rice symbolizes a special register of consumption, the shortage of which was associated with the complexity of acquisition, which may or may not be a function of real scarcity, with evidence of rampant practices in hoarding and black marketing. So by mapping this continuum of rural poverty, Sen's post-colonial film actually therefore draws out the political message of this accumulated famine-encoded literature that I have been talking about, and its significance in the formation of public opinion on rural poverty in the decades after independence. Sen's inspiration for Akaler Shandhane possibly derives from a moral compulsion to portray a long-standing dilemma among the urban intelligentsia. There is also a scene that we could have shown where towards the end, there is this tension of having any faith in this team of camera workers, crews coming into the village and even bothering to portray their life. That it's better you go back to your city lab rather than come to the village to capture our lives. That tension is there. So there's this, it's kind of representative of this long-standing dilemma among the urban intelligentsia who struggle in the film to comprehend and resolve rural poverty from a grassroots perspective of activism. The film relies on the plot of famine and unravels the contribution of famine literature for shaping a post-colonial discourse on food sovereignty by highlighting the issue of survival. The impact of deprivation of rice manifests variously in the form of hunger, malnutrition, and rehabilitation, using the mandate from existing politics of provision as well as the politics of survival that we have seen have been encoded in the language, literature, and oral history of the famine. So broadly speaking, these intersecting issues in the film are concerned with the materiality of rice and the ways in which this creates discourses and impacts upon people's lives and society. So at a symbolic and conceptual level, therefore, changing meanings of rice derived from famine art and literature feed into the process of delineating transformations in peasant power over struggles with food. And understanding these changes also contribute to mapping the differences between the more fundamentally institutionalized process of agricultural development and policy formulation on one hand, and on the other hand, the fluid and the more contested symbols of agrarian power relations. But with that, I want to also talk a little bit more as to how we can look at the importance of literature as it draws out in the historiography. Because we've already seen that the word famine was substituted in later state policies with various words like shortage, malnutrition, and all of this actually gives you a clue as to how political discourses later was shaped around some of these strategies with policymaking. But at the same time, what these various terms and these various conditions in which the public consciousness of famine has been shaped also allows us to think about how famine has been represented later and remembered. So the later film that I already said I was going to talk about, Shadows of Bengal, some of the key moments in that film that was done by Partho Bhattacharya and Joy, based in Paris. And I had the great chance to meet these directors and do a bit of, I have this habit of actually doing a bit of ethnographic work with the way the film is showed, and then gathering the evidence from the audience who watch this film to see how famine films are being received and the question answers that follow around it, to connect with my study of famine literature and art in the contemporary period of history and how it's spanning out now, including using the later decades of literature and art that I've used, bringing it up to the food movement, then 80s Mrinal Sen, and now, of course, the whole discourse is back in the political agenda as to who is responsible for the 1943 famine, again in Britain, with the decolonization perspective of understanding British history and its role in India. So with this film, Bengal Shadows, the film ends with clinging on to Churchill's statue, but it also constantly looks at the witnesses. What those witnesses remember is the way that women had sacrificed. It's kind of gory details of the scenes in which people remember how women died, but they wouldn't. They would still give their breast milk to their children. And these are the things that become quite important, with lots of people then who were Indians present among the audience have said, "Oh, I'm from Bihar, but I didn't know there was a Bengal famine happening. And I never knew until now I saw the film." Now that's a huge leap between his generation and his generational remembrance of famine outside Bengal. And then he sees this film, and then he's absolutely finding it absolutely a novel thing. And so it's used as if we need to re-educate people to remember famine, and to then question the role of Churchill and others in this context as well. So what I'm trying to say here in a nutshell is how the construction of famine literature and the construction of films around famine are still ongoing, and the dialogue is now also in the realm of public history. And public history is becoming even more important in the current context of media and the interventions of the media, and how the definition of public itself is becoming so flexible and so wide that it brings us back to the story of how famine itself was being interpreted at a time when people were still constructing their own causes and finding ways of resolving through collective action and looking at the importance of collective responsibility. I think this is where the shift will be, that we need to very carefully look at the historical culture in its more totality to interpret how we remember certain incidents in colonial history, and whether we should look at from the point of causes, reparations, and so forth, or look at the way the culture behind those events have evolved and are construed in public memory and are being used as well, either for political advantage, or is it something that is going to be rebuilt into decolonizing the vision of many colonial officials as to how they looked at the culture of food security in the region. So there's a cross dialogue that is possible with the emergence of these new media and literary interventions that are happening. So I'll stop here, and I would like questions if there are any, and take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Di, for this wonderful talk. Yes, we have 2-3 questions line up there, and I'm telling. First of all, there is one from Dr. Ghosh that From a very contemporary standpoint, would you look at the plight of migrant laborers during this lockdown as another potential FOOP movement that obviously critique ineffectual political governance?
Yes, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, people are still, if you look at the way the social media is responding to the, the plight of the migrant laborers, when they are queuing up for food and they're standing to beg for food, these images are kind of a reminder of famine, and people have been talking about it in the same way they remember the migration from the village to the city. And of course, the tensions are very different here when the migrant laborer is actually moving back to the village, is being thrown out because they don't trust whether they're bringing the disease or not. But that trust is already broken in this context because they have moved away from the village for so long. Whereas in the 1943, the situation was from one of the texts that, especially Nabarno, he's looking forward to going back to the village and to restart his farm and his homeland. So the definition of homeland is very, very still sort of pure in many ways. And there's a lot of faith in going back to the homeland. But here, the migrant laborer has become almost not only a different species in the urban setting, but he's also looked upon as if he's an outsider into the village. So it shows the way the rural-urban relationship has changed. And that's something quite probably quite interesting to see when and how these shifts have occurred over a long period of migration, and the values these migrant laborers have. Is it something that is just cash economy, or is it back to the land and the importance of his connections with the land? Maybe these are very dispossessed people as well, whereas the text during the famine period refers to the right to go back to the land, the right to still cultivate and go back to the village. So it's a bit different.
Yes.
But the context is very much a reminder, and it's these kind of images that you can look at. What reminds you of the situation, the Bengal famine. So yeah, the contemporary situation is very interesting to look into.
Okay, thanks, Lotte, for this take. There is another one that is that in Ashwini Sanket, the role of the girl who goes to Pura Judu to fetch rice at the cost of her own virginity, or the female protagonist in Okaler Sandhane who goes to the Kachabari for milk for her own son, are revealed by the men in those two texts by Vibhuti Bhushan and by it's Amalendu Chakraborty. So how did patriarchy operate in constructing these females in times of such crises, and what was the state of the social and moral order then? Can this be seen as a case during this pandemic too? What is your take on it?
Well, even in the pandemic situation, the role of the women in the household. I mean, if you look at Grinnell's work, then he is very much talking about the traditional structure of dependence, both between the patron and the client, and the expectations within the household, where the women are still willing to give the last morsel first to the husband, to the child, and then take the last bit. Now, I'm not ashamed to say that this is something I'm groomed into, and I still feel that I would do the same still. Now, this is kind of a very cultural underpinning of the role of the women in the household. And when that woman is going out to get food and selling the body, now that is not immediately seen as prostitution as a profession. That leap did not happen, and that leap will not also happen now. So there is some kind of continuity in expectations of patriarchy as to what the woman should do in relation to food. I think it's quite important to bring it back to the domain of food, because that's the key area of our discussion as to how we construe food and how we look at the role of food in times of crisis and scarcity. And I can say that still within the family, the food is seen as something to be acquired with honesty and with integrity. And even when you part and give the food, it has to be as if you're fulfilling some kind of role. And I did mention in the beginning of the paper that how the importance of rice is linked to this kind of a ritual, a practice, the religious as well as the social and the cultural expectations of what you do with rice. Even if you had your last morsel there, would you give it to your child or would you eat it yourself? You know, the causation of famine in other parts of the world has been linked to lots of causes, you know, whether it's divine disgrace or whether you kind of look at, if you look at Chinese famine texts, for instance, there's a lot of emphasis on looking at the causation that is divine. But here, the causation has been quite a lot linked to what is material circumstances in the famine literature. And that is therefore linked to the social, moral, political roles of individuals in a family household. Here I have shown in the family literature how the decisions have moved beyond the realm of the household because the woman has to go out and already there's evidence that they have to sell their bodies to get the last morsel. So here the working woman might still retain a bit of rice before he or she parts. So it's interesting to see the change of the women's role within the household and the decision she is taking, having got the clues working outside that household realm as well. So it depends on what the woman would do and in what circumstances. Will she part with the last bit of rice if she's in the office canteen, or will she part with the last bit of rice if it was a home circumstances? And even the pandemic, if tomorrow there is no grain in your market, then we are back in the same situation. I think that might not happen because
Yes.
depends on the supply and who's controlling. But certainly, you know, the parallels are coming, and the parallels are coming back in that generation who have actually seen famine. So when I'm talking to that generation now, there is constantly a reflection of are we going to face this threat? So the sense of insecurity is tied to the insecurity around the food grain still.
Yes.
Yeah.
And at the same time, while we are talking about Vibhuti it's Ashani Sanket or the Intimations of Thunder, there I have recently come across an article by Dia Gupta where she interrogates the representation of bodies on the Indian home front in 1943, the year of the Bengal famine. And there she began by examining the letters of Indian soldiers wrote to their families from Middle Eastern battlegrounds, and there it it is somehow analyzed that how the emphatic role of the soldiers' bodies as they imagined the distant hunger. And let me tell you that line of Vibhuti Bhushan where he also imagines World War II as a predatory beast feeding upon the bodies of the Bengali villagers. So do you think that the cultural history of Bengal famine can be recovered through those wartime letters, and how far the practice of those letter writing and literature can be read alongside each other to note down or portray the experience of hunger?
Yeah, I mean, you know, wartime again. It would definitely enlighten the literature existing around wartime, which is centered on rumor mongering and falsification of figures and statistics and food supplies. You know, then we can actually look at the more real life experiences of people who are in the war front, and the fact that the army's supplies were quite crucial to determining what the supplies would be in the cities or in the villages. There's always this, the food supply is linked to how much the army is consuming and who is getting first in the army. What would be those distinctions even within the army between the Indian soldier and the British soldier? Those kind of life experiences would be quite important to retrieve from those letters. I think That's a different kind of documentation as well, where the individual is positioned here within an institution where elements of loyalty is playing, because there's a lot of confidential information that maybe the army officers would not give you the particular value of how they were treated in the canteens or how their food was served. But it's about how you connect that memory of fighting in the war and with the food crisis. If the letters speak of that, then we do have a glimpse of alternative evidence that can sit with the more traditional ways of looking at military literature around that time. So yeah, I do think there's quite a bit of scope here to disentangle the notion that most
Yes,
of
yes, yes.
wartime
And at the same time,
documentation.
I guess, yes, yes. And I guess, you also, for the fact that in that 75th anniversary year of that Bengal famine, that Prashant Chaudhary travels to that K plot. Remember the K plot in the
Mm,
Sundarbans to meet the survivors, and
mm,
the island is called as the K plot. So by taking the interviews also, to some extent we
mm.
can revive those traumatic memories, and we can feel the pain and how much they have gone through those traumatic histories, and their wounded memories. So it's about
Yeah,
some kind of collective trauma also on their part, what I
yeah.
think.
So that is exactly what I'm trying to also talk of here. That how does this famine experience link up
Yes,
with a framework which directly relates to historical consciousness, that is related to the individual based experience, the mental and the moral conditions of that individual person who is then talking to the history and the past, which is, the
yes,
traditional areas of memory and identity issues. And the other is to relate to the historical culture of famine as well. That is the totality of all observable and the more objective manifestations of the famine. So when we
okay,
look
okay.
at literature and memory in relation to famine, it's quite important to relate to these two aspects simultaneously. The totality of the individual's the totality of all mental, individually based processes of relating to the past, as well as the totality of something that is observable and are objective as well about the family. So, if we connect these two, then we can actually we can try to unravel the way famine is remembered and the need
Remembered.
to recreate those memories as well. So when the
Yes,
interviews, we need to understand how to read these interviews as well. Okay, the
represented.
filmmaker has made the interview and has done the interview and is presenting us in the film. But what I'm saying is that when we are hearing these interviews as the audience, we need to connect what those individuals are saying and and how are they talking to the past. In what capacity? Are they carrying that collective identity with them, or they are just thinking of what they have heard?
Thinking of the
Yeah, the individual versus the collective is,
collective. That's,
yeah, is
we
what.
would like to thank you for
Thank you.
talking us about these unsung areas, and I truly appreciate
Mhm.
all the time and care you took
It's
in
very
telling
late
us all
now.
this.
Yeah,
And we know how busy you are, and so we are grateful that you would
thank
take
you.
the time to prepare it and spend a beautiful evening with us. And our audience was intrigued by the new possibilities for this global research, and we truly are becoming interdisciplinary scholars. Several in our group also have expressed appreciation and the information that you presented on Bengal famine, and several of our people are looking at the ways that we might
Yeah,
implement some of your suggestions also. And the consensus is that they would like to they would like you to talk again, and we hope that you will consent to speak to us again perhaps next year. And till then,
My pleasure.
thanks
I
a lot.
mean, this is a continuous research, is what I'm trying to also
Yes.
say. You know, the method of this research is not to be confined to what has been represented during that period of famine. But if you look at the methodology, I'm saying, is the life of the famine literature in the public domain of history and how it's constantly shaping and being reshaped by the more current contemporary questions, whether it's pandemic, decolonization, or making Churchill accountable, you know, this drive to actually dig out the past and engage with the past through the Bengal famine is just what? This is 2020, that was 1943. So what is going on in this long period? I mean, we owe a lot to Amartya Sen's seminal work to divert us to the more social and the cultural compass of famine. And then we are working more to dig out, you know, whether legal entitlement is the entire story, or does this whole issue of entitlement that he talks of takes us beyond to the more extra legal territory of understanding famine and beyond that. So that's my take. And I'm very pleased to have presented the work that's ongoing. And I hope to be able to engage later. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So, on behalf of the Honorable Principal Dr. C.K. Panda, respected Ekena, our coordinator of IQAC, and Mrs. Sirupa Maulanabi, HOD of the Department of English, Barabazar College, and our most valued invited speakers and all the listeners and participants, it's my absolute privilege to have you been asked to propose the vote of thanks on this wonderful occasion. I cannot thank everyone enough for their involvement and their willingness to take on the completion of tasks beyond their comfort zones. I, on behalf of Barabazar Bikram Tudu Memorial College, under it's affiliated under Sidhu Kanu Birsa University, West Bengal, Purulia, and the entire team working behind this platform, let me call it fraternity of interdisciplinary studies here together, and on my behalf extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all the invited speakers for gracing your important works and sharing with us your findings and opinions for these 3 days. And I would like to thank all the participants who have been running around doing a lot of things in these days. They have given the feedback form also, and they are posting their questions. So it's a kind of collective betterment that we're all going through. Thanks very much. And finally, the wonderful students of our college who have turned up in such great numbers, not only from our department, but also from the department of other colleges also. Thank you very much for your participation. Once again, I thank all for your cordial cooperation. So let it call it be a day. Thanks a lot. Stay safe, stay sound.
Send some of the comments that I didn't see.
Yes.
I would like the comments to come forward, because I think there's a lot of insight that people have put, like Prem Chand's short story. Now I can see that's
yes, those are the most wonderful comments. That yes,
because these are very, very special to me, to be able to gather this kind of public feedback, because unless we also engage with the dialogue around this topic, then it won't be as live as I would have expected. So I would love these live comments, and I really look forward to talking to you again. And thank you again very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. And a very good night.
Thanks. Thanks a lot to all the participants. Till then, bye-bye. Stay safe, stay sound. Thanks.